Dyer wave.
3.
Our anthropology is not derived by human psychology or, empirical data from MIT or something like this. It's derived from the revealed aspect of what we see in Christology. And so there's no real way to diagnose man's problem and to understand man and man's anthropology, as I said, without the right theology.
All right, what's up? Welcome, you guys. There we go. We switched over to Ethernet, so we should be good. It says the connection's good now. So hope you guys are doing good. It is Sunday night. Hope you all had a good Lord's Day. And we are going to open this up for open forum here in a second. I did have a couple words that I wanted to talk about that came to mind this week because, as you guys know, welcome everybody. Just come on in. I switched to Ethernet instead of wireless. That's why I cut out for a second if you're on YouTube. So it's open forum tonight. We're going to be talking about anything relating to Trinity, deity of Christ, biblical theology, Calvinism, Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, philosophy, transcendental argumentations, justification, natural theology, Platonism, pre-Socratics, epistemology, eschatology, preterism, any of those or anything else in those domains you want to bring up, feel free to tonight. And I did want to tout the fact that we did have our first course over at Richard Grove's excellent Autonomy University. I taught the first course, which was the pre-Socratics introduction. The course is called Introduction to Philosophy. We did the pre-Socratics. We spent about 3.5 hours the other night on that. It went really good, a lot of fun, a lot of great feedback. I have a better idea now of how that's going to work. And what we're going to do is we're going to finish the course. And when the course is finished, it'll be opened up to the public, right? So this is not like kind of the typical courses that you've seen in, if you go to Jay's analysis, you get like the course on tragedy and hope. Well, I guess it's kind of like that, right? We did 10 talks or 8 talks on tragedy and hope. I think we did 8 talks on Plato's Republic, these kinds of things. This is going to be more like a college class. And so we have, some textbooks If you're interested in that class, the way it'll work is when the courses are done over the next 12 weeks, it'll be then for sale, and it'll still be a lot cheaper than straight up college classes, right? But it is going to be a little more than, you know, the dirt cheap prices at Jay's Analysis. And that's also right because Richard has put a lot of time and effort, all of his people, into producing this. So it's actually a full-on course, as in like a master's class, in the sense of the way that you would, you know, go to somebody, you know, David Lynch's master class on philosophy, or Jordan Peterson teaches a master class on psychology, right? Well, this is better than that because not only do you have, you know, the 2-3 hours of course, you also have another hour or two of Q&A. So it's a way superior to those kinds of pop, low quality things that are put out, and they put a lot of time and effort into producing it. So we did the first lecture. It went really good. We spent 3 hours on the pre-Socratics, and it was nice to go back and review a lot of the stuff that I hadn't thought about in many, many years. I don't remember the last time I thought about pre-Socratics, but so for the course for the course syllabus, we're using this part 1 of Copleston. It's pretty classic, pretty well known history of philosophy. He does a great job of summarizing every pre-Socratic guy's various views, and he does a really good job with Plato and Aristotle. So we're going to be working from that text, but we also have specific courses where we're going to deal with individual domains of philosophy. For example, we're going to do epistemology. We'll be using the W.J. Wood book, which you guys have heard me recommend a lot. In that same series, there's the Metaphysics book that we'll be using, which is very short and readable, by William Hasker, Metaphysics, Constructing a Worldview. And then there's also the ethics book in that series, which I don't actually have yet. But that'll be coming on the way. And then we'll probably refer at times to Lawrence Bonjour's text on epistemology, which when I do the epistemology class, we'll have a guest lecturer come in. We're going to have Father Deacon Dr. Ananias will join me in this course. That'll be some weeks away when we do that. And then Father Vladimir will join me for the aesthetics class as a guest speaker. And so we have a day dedicated to each domain of philosophy, and then the rest of the lectures, you know, the next 6 or 7 will be the next several historical epochs. So we're kind of doing history of Western philosophy, to be precise. So we're going to work through the pre-Socratics, then Plato, Aristotle. Then we're going to do a specific class on epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. Then we're going to have the patristics. We're going to do Augustine, Cappadocians, John of Damascus. That's my choice for key figures in the patristic era, because if you take this class at, say, a Catholic university or a state university, they're going to talk about Augustine, and they're going to go directly to Aquinas. Okay, we're not going to do that. Okay, we're going to talk about the real movers and shakers in the patristic period, who were not, this was not limited to Augustine. We definitely want to talk about Augustine, but we want to talk about the Cappadocians, because the Cappadocians are more important, I dare say, than Augustine, especially for the Orthodox Church, because it's the Cappadocian doctrine of the Trinity, not the Augustinian view, that is accepted at Constantinople I. Thus, the Ecumenical Council trumps any individual. So we're going to be talking about that. And then, of course, you know, we've spent a lot of time on Maximus, John Damascus. So in that course, which will go for 3 or 4 hours, we'll put a lot of time into those figures. And then we'll move to the Middle Ages. We'll talk about Scotus. We'll talk about Aquinas, obviously, you know, and some of those key medieval philosophers. And we'll also mention some of the key medieval Byzantine theologians and philosophers as well. Because, again, I can tell you from a lot of, you know, mainline, what do they call it, where you have to get approved, you know, like the accredited reading lists, right? In American universities, they don't talk about Byzantium. Okay, you don't get anything to do with Photius the Great. You don't get anything to do with anybody in Byzantium at all. Okay, you don't know any. They don't even talk about it. It's like a forbidden word. You can't talk about this, and that's ridiculous, especially if you're Orthodox. So we will be talking about. We're not going to go into every obscure Byzantine philosopher, but we will be talking about the important figures in, you know, Orthodox theology. And so, you know, Richard has really not put any strictures on what I talk about, which is great. So, So yeah, that's really cool for them to offer that. And Richard's always been a good guest and a good podcast host in his own right. He has a pretty popular, well-known podcast for many years, Grand Theft World. He just did a really long interview with Whitney Webb, which I just watched that yesterday, and that was a really good interview. So props to Richard, and props to him to kind of giving me free reign, and we'll be able to bring in a lot of these, maybe not a lot, but at least a couple guest speakers, maybe some other ones if I think about it. And this is a dry run, so this will be a course, full-on introduction to Western philosophy, to be specific, covering, from the pre-Socratics all the way up to the modern period. So, after the medievals, we'll get into the Enlightenment figures. We're going to do, Descartes. Then we'll do, the empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and then we'll move to, probably some of these other important figures like Hegel and Husserl, Heidegger a little bit. And then, Nietzsche, existentialists, and the modern collapse, basically. Postmodernism and nihilism is where it all kind of ends. So it's kind of like a train wreck. The history of philosophy is a giant train wreck. And all of that to say that I was just reminded how history repeats, especially the history of ideas repeats, because going back and reading Copleston's chapters on the pre-Socratics, I was amazed at how many pre-Socratic discoveries, quote unquote, or theories are still the theories today and are still being debated today. And if you guys saw that tweet that I got quite a few views on the other day, Anaximander talking about straight up hard, like I knew that the Greek atomists and these ancient pre-Socratics talked about evolution, and I knew they talked about materialism and atomism, yes. But I didn't realize how precise they actually were. And if you look at that tweet, like Anaximander's, like he's straight up saying, oh, there's actually a multiverse, right? And then he goes on to say that, oh yeah, by the way, all of the beings that exist, including man, evolved out of the sea creatures through adaptation. And it goes even further than that, right? I mean, they talk about, they basically have debates on atheism, monism, dualism, materialism, stasis versus change, one versus many. All of these, pantheism, evolution, right? They're all present in the pre-Socratics, which is kind of amazing if you think about it. Right? So has philosophy really progressed, or is it really just stuck in the train wreck mire that has always been? Because most of the history of philosophy is autonomous thinking, and it's autonomous because it's a train wreck. Yeah, so we got into the seeds doctrine, which actually is the early logos spermaticos doctrine, right? So one thing that's amazing, beyond just the kind of way ahead of their time in terms of secular theories, I don't believe in multiverse. I don't believe in, that all the creatures evolved out of the primordial soup, right? But it's amazing in a limited sense, in a worldly sense, in that they were so... basically, and it might just be a situation where, maybe Charles Darwin read, Anaximander and just cribbed it, right? I mean, and he didn't give a footnote. So we talked about that in the course, if you were in the course. But anyway, yeah. So abstract materialism is what Copleston characterizes some of the pre-Socratics, the early pre-Socratics, as having the Ionians. So anyway, that's going to be fun. And I think you're going to notice if you take that course, the other thing I wanted to say is that, like, you really can't understand Plato and Aristotle without understanding the pre-Socratics, because Plato and Aristotle are grappling with a lot of the problems that the pre-Socratics were grappling with. And, we went through each one of them, the key figures in that talk, so it took so long. And we hit the highlights, and they're all talking about identity over time, right? What is the nature of an object? What is the essence of an object such that it is that object and not another object, even though there's flux and change? So stasis versus flux, one versus many, right? The one and the many question that Plato grapples with so often is the very question that has enamored so many of the pre-Socratics before him. And then we'll notice that Plato does take some ideas from some of the pre-Socratics to modify, including, perhaps even the aporon, it would appear that Plato's apophatic theology of the good, of the one, that seems to be, that's where he's getting it, right? But again, I'm not a Plato scholar, but I've read, I've got my Republic and my works of Plato right here, and I mean, I've read the majority of it, so I may not be an expert, but I'm competent, to talk about it. So, and one thing that gave me a little more confidence was that, because it's been, I haven't had Plato courses in probably 15 years, right? In all my Plato stuff was undergrad. So looking back at Copleston's reading of Plato, he reads it exactly the same way I did. So that gives me a little more confidence that, I was on the right track. And there's quite a few things in Plato that anticipate Orthodox theology as well as transcendental argumentation. Transcendental arguments aren't just kind of early in Aristotle and the Metaphysics or transcendental type arguments. They're also similar types of reasoning and argumentation in Plato as well, because again, Plato is really, really concerned with the one and the many issue and finding an ultimate unifying principle. And that was the question that obsessed so many of the pre-Socratics. What is the ultimate unifying principle? Oh, it's air. Oh, it's water. Oh, it's fire. Oh, it's seeds, right? So anyway, we're going to have fun with that. And I read several chapters today, just refreshing, getting Copleston's reading of Plato's epistemology and Plato's metaphysics. So it's going to be a lot of fun. If you would, guys, hit like and share. I think it was the right thing to move over to the Ethernet cable because I got a steady connection here. No interruptions. And the way it works is that I open this up to anybody who wants to come on and ask a question. Father Deacon Dr. Ananias is present as well. So remember, there are a few rules, and if you don't keep to the rules, you'll just immediately get booted. You won't even get any time at all. The topics of discussion do not relate to me. Now, if you want to ask a question about something, that's okay. But the topic, like if you think I'm the worst human being on the planet, that has nothing to do with whether the arguments and discussions tonight or the topics are true or false, right? Literally nothing to do with it. Totally disconnected. If you don't give arguments, you get booted. An argument is not arguing. An argument is thesis, right? Conclusion. Premise, conclusion, right? Evidences for your thesis. Those are in the domain of argumentation, debate. Talking about how dumb somebody is. Talking about how fake and gray I am. Not argumentation. Not argument. You might have the thesis that I'm fake and gray, but you need to back that up with proofs and evidences. You see, that's the difference here. Another thing I noticed too that I want to highlight is pretty much all I've noticed in the last couple of weeks, and then in terms of some of the post lecture discussion that we had in the philosophy class, and I'm not knocking anybody in particular in the philosophy class because this is actually an important issue, and I want everybody tonight to pay attention to this. And I think Father Deacon Dr. I can't even say it right. Father Deacon Dr. Ananias will be interviewing Dr. Garraby, who wrote the paper that we've referenced many times about theistic.
I haven't got the interviewing part. I'm just going to have a...
You're going to?
Well, I'm going to speak with him.
You're going to speak with him. I'm sorry. I thought you meant speak on a live stream. You just meant have a conversation. Never mind.
Yeah, I was thinking when I wrote that it could be misinterpreted.
Oh, you mean words have multiple meanings? I thought they only have one meaning. That's what I was going to say. You
gave me a good idea. I should ask him if he'd like to come on and be interviewed.
Yeah, and so what I'm getting at is what we oftentimes refer to in this hairy arena of philosophy as the word concept fallacy. And the reason this is a fallacy is that different words have different meanings in different contexts. And sometimes in philosophy, they mean different things to different philosophers. And I'm glad that this came up, in the course discussion that we had, because people were asking, and tonight is not going to be all about that philosophy course. I'm just kind of hyping you guys up and giving you a little teaser about it. But for example, we had a couple terms that came up there that in different philosophers and in different times have different reference. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm just always reminded how often this leads people to problems, right? It leads people to confusion and, again, heresies, and not just heresies, but even world religions go in different directions because, I mean, let's put it this way. Most of the heresies in the world religions differ from us, from orthodoxy, etc., on two things. They differ on the Old Testament. That's a huge 90% of it. And then word concept fallacies. Almost all the heretics at some point, this Basil says this, he says most of the heretics are messing up in mistaking the meanings of words in grammar and predication. So, and I wanted to give a couple examples of things because I want to encourage people tonight, if you're listening, and when we open this up in a second, to not fall into this simple mistake that so many people fall into. And it's something that I think happens to people that are new to philosophy or new to theology or these topics, that they think that, well, the way that you learn these words is that you go and look them up. And that's typically true of most things. But when you get to really technical, precise areas and domains of things that are not like science or empirical data and research, right? If you want to go look up what the definition of, bromine is or something, right? I mean, that's easy to do if you're a science man, right? What's the definition of water? It's H2O. Okay, all right. But guess what? In philosophy, some of these terms are not that easy, and they're not going to be the same across different systems. And this comes up in natural theology as well, because that's part of the reason natural theology has so many fallacious conclusions, is because of these false assumptions that don't even relate necessarily to philosophy. They actually relate to grammar. In fact, some of these points are actually could be shown and demonstrated just in grammar. You don't even have to get into philosophy, right? You could just look at the grammar and point out, well, don't you think that words can have different senses in different contexts, right? Don't you think that the intentional context has something to do with in what sense the word might be being used? Of course. So, I mean, let's look at a couple notorious things in the history of philosophy that just in the Eleatics, for example, that we saw this week. We'll look at the bottom one first because that's one that pops up in the Eleatics. And this is just to illustrate. I'm not going to go into what I taught in the course. This is just illustrating a point that comes up so often. So let's look at the bottom one there, the one. Okay, each one of the Eleatics basically says the one, which is their ultimate unifying principle, is a different thing, right? One guy says it's water. One guy says it's fire. One guy says it's air. One guy says it's flux. One guy says it's permanence. One guy says it's seeds, the logos spermaticos. Plato says it's the good, the beautiful. Okay, so does the word one have a single referent in these philosophers? The answer is no, right? And I'm illustrating it with these Eleatics, with these pre-Socratic Ionian Milesian philosophers. Okay, well, so I can't read each of those guys in succession and think that because they use the word one, that they're all referring to the same one. Isn't that kind of obvious? Doesn't everybody get this? Okay, and if that's the case, doesn't it stand to reason that Plato and Aristotle's one, or first cause, isn't even necessarily identical to the one of the Eleatics or the pre-Socratics? So let's say, for the sake of argument, that the aperon, the boundless, that is used by some of the pre-Socratics, let's say that for the sake of argument, Plato is borrowing that concept. Does he identify it as the same referent as the guys before him? No, he doesn't. Oh, okay. So does Plato have the same theology as the pre-Socratics? No. Oh, okay. Well, do the pre-Socratics all have the same, quote, theology amongst themselves? No. Okay, so then there's not a single referent across systems just because the word ONE is used. And if we admit this, Roman Catholics, do you see this? Doesn't this itself show that natural theology isn't true? In other words, classical theism, as presented by the natural theology proponents, that quote, to quote Phaser, the God of classical theism is the God of the Neoplatonists, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Maimonides, and Avicenna. That's what Phaser says. So the God of classical theism is the same God of these varying, totally different and distinct systems. Okay, well, but they have some things in common. Okay, so what? I mean, between the Eleatics, they have some things in common. They use this word O-N-E, so the words are in common. But they define it as totally different things. And their very arguments are in contrast to the dude before them. So if one guy says, oh, everything's water, that's the one. And the next guy comes and says, no, you idiot. It's not all water, it's all fire. Clearly. Would we conclude they have the same referent because they have the same word? How dumb is this? This is a grammar issue. It's not even a philosophy issue. And yeah, I mean, grammar does relate to philosophy because in Plato especially, right, we're dealing with predication. How can we predicate particulars and universals, right? That's something that Plato, as well as the pre-Socratics, are all obsessed with. But let's look at a couple of other notorious examples in the history of philosophy. Logos. How often do we hear that logos, right, is the same thing in Heraclitus as it is in Plato, as it is in John 1, as it is in Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics? Okay, but it's not. Because who does John 1 say the logos is? The referent picks out Jesus, the second person of the Godhead. Okay, is that the referent in Marcus Aurelius? No, it's not. Okay. And logos is used in a lot of different ways in the history of philosophy, right? In Plato, it means explanation, reason, and perhaps even law. And that's in the Cambridge Companion of Plato. There's a whole lecture in there on logos and law in Plato. Or excuse me, a whole chapter, which I recommend. What about the word being? Being, I think somebody told me that this last week. Heidegger even pointed out how notorious this and unclear this notion of being is in the history of philosophy. And yet in natural theology, we're supposed to just realize, oh, well, there's a common, obvious, self-evident understanding of the word being. We all know what being is. And being bees, right? According to Roman Catholic philosophers that I've known over the years, right? What's the ultimate truth of everything? Oh, being bees, he said. The guy who did his PhD in Anselm. Okay, but being can mean different things in different systems. Let's give an example. Let's say I'm a Greek philosopher and I think that everything that exists is on a single chain of being, including the God at the top of it, the monad, whatever. Or maybe I think he's beyond being. Okay, whatever. It doesn't matter. Let's say that everything is on a chain of being. Oh, okay. So does that have the same sense as a Christian who believes that there's uncreated being and created being? Well, they all have the same word. It's the same word, so it's the same thing. No, it's not. Being, for a person who believes in creation, is going to be different from the being of a person who believes in emanation, that everything emanates on a chain of being from the one. Okay, so that's, again, it should be obvious that these words don't always mean the same thing. Another classic example of this is the word reason. For example, to an idealist, reason is the fundamental nature of reality itself. Plato is an idealist. Plato thinks that reason is fundamental to reality. Mind is fundamental to reality. It is ultimate reality. But does that have the same significance in somebody like David Hume? Nope. Reasoning is just a sort of a habit that we have, right? It's a useful habit that we have. But we, according to Hume, it's just a kind of a faculty that we have that associates different ideas together. That's it. It has nothing to do with the metaphysics of the world in David Hume. Oh, but they're both using the same word. Okay, it means the same thing. No, it doesn't. Obviously. Two fundamentally different philosophical systems. David Hume being the preeminent materialist empiricist, and Plato being the rationalist idealist. Okay, so the word reason even though it's the same word, it's going to have very different senses in different philosophers. And all of that just to illustrate that a lot of heresies, remember what does John Damascus say on the Orthodox faith? All the heresies stem from confusing nature and person. He's speaking generally there about a philosophic confusion that leads people to confuse, for example, elements in the Trinity. Well, the Trinity doesn't make sense. It's illogical because God is one. He can't be three if he's one. Then you ask the Muslim the same questions about the 99 names, and they flounder around and can't answer it because they don't realize that they have the exact same dilemma. It's just that they want to be excused from the question when it comes to the 99 names. Oh, but you're liable to answer to that so-called challenge on the fact that there's three hypostases. Okay. So the point is that nature and person, typically, not always, you can have a heresy or something like that comes from, I don't know, the end times. But most of the time when it comes to heresy proper in terms of the Trinity and Christology, the fathers noted that it was a confusion of nature and person in some way. A blending of them, a mixing of them, a collapsing of them. Remember Eric Ibarra saying that Nestorius is right, that we should speak of Nestorius being correct in his dual Christology, and that we shouldn't distinguish nature and person. I mean, just amazing that how is anybody following these people? I don't know when they say such ridiculous and stupid heterodox things, but I guess that's where we are. So just remember that when you're making arguments in this way, in this domain, especially people that are going to come if you're anti-Trinitarian, even the cults that misunderstand the early church fathers, right? Like, Constantine created the Catholic Church, like Seventh-day Adventists, right? A lot of times they'll rely on word concept fallacies. The Eucharist is pagan because you believe in eating is cannibalism, right? As if the words always mean one thing. And there's nuance here is what I'm trying to say. We don't believe in cannibalism because we're not eating a dead person. That's what cannibalism is. I guess you could eat a live person too, but we are mystically feeding on the deifying power of the God-man who is not dead. Okay, so we're not eating the dead, which is in the Old Testament, that's what makes it unclean. So, hopefully everybody remembers this, because after doing this for so many years and having so many debates, particularly in theology, but it comes up in philosophy too, these are the problems that people have. They can't understand what these words mean, and that they might have different meanings in different contexts, and they don't want to go into nuance. And as St. Basil says, if you can't go into the nuance, then don't do theology. If you can't do this kind of stuff, this domain isn't for you. All right, let's open it up. I'm going to quit talking. Remember, the way this works is that on the Twitter space, if you come in, you request to speak. I will then allow you to speak. I give you the microphone, basically. I give you the okay. You're going to be automatically muted. It's not me doing that. That's the way Twitter's system works. You're automatically muted. So you request to speak. I allow you to come speak. Then you have the duty, guys, to unmute yourself. Just remember, it takes a second. Unmute yourself. Please, I don't want to sit here for 3 hours and repeat 100 times. Unmute, and then you come on and you say, is it working? Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you, but you have to hit unmute. So what's our lesson tonight, guys? You have to hit unmute. All right, so the first question that we have, again, open forum. You can you don't have to debate if you don't want to. You don't have to present arguments. You can ask questions. You don't have to ask me. You can ask Father Deacon since he's here. There's no hard laws here. Just keep it civil. And if you do want to make an argument or present your case, let me know that, and then tell me when you're done. I'll let you speak as long as you want. First up is Pilgrim. Howdy, Pilgrim. Yes, I had to do a ridiculous John Wayne.
Hey, Jay.
Hey.
Hey, I have a couple questions. Okay.
Sure.
My first question is, I just finished Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, and there's this one quote from Saint Maximus in the chapter of the Economy of the Sun that is, I think I get it, but I want to make sure I understand what he's saying. It says, the death of the death of Christ on the cross is a judgment of judgment. What exactly does that mean?
Well, I think he's referring to the judgment of judgment being the death that God judged us to be liable for. So in other words, death is the judgment that God gave to humanity due to Adam. And then Christ is judging death, the angel of death, Satan, and destroying his power over human nature.
Perfect. That's what I thought. And I have a question about the harrowing of Hades.
Sure.
Did that happen? Hades is not eternal, right?
Right. So Hades is the realm of the dead. It's kind of like the kingdom of the dead. So I think that what we're supposed to think is that when Satan fell, he kind of had his own kingdom, which is this kingdom of the dead, the realm of the dead. When people before the time of Christ died, everybody went to Hades, both the wicked and the righteous. And so Hades is like a holding place prior to the judgment. But when Christ went to Hades, he tricked the devil. So this was kind of the ransom theory of the atonement in terms of a lot of the church fathers. And by Satan inviting the Son of God into his kingdom, he kind of, like a virus, it sort of destroyed Satan's own power over his own kingdom. And so now even death is not to be feared, and death and Hades will be destroyed, we're told, in the lake of fire. So there is a kingdom of Hades that will exist as the realm of the dead until the resurrection and the final judgment. And then in the final judgment, when it says death and Hades are destroyed, that means that there won't be any more physical bodily death, but the wicked will still have eternal life, and they will experience the fire of God as torment.
Right. So I guess my question is the harrowing of Hades, did that happen in the space and time of the 3 days after the crucifixion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because he took the Old Testament saints as a cloud of witness with him in the ascension. And that's why at the end of Matthew it says that different Old Testament patriarchs were seen walking around.
Right.
So that's kind of like a predecessor to the final resurrection, right? So the Matthew 27, when we see different Old Testament saints walking around, that's supposed to be like a foreshadowing of the final resurrection.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That answers my questions a lot. Thanks for your time.
But it is important to note, I think, which is kind of what you're hinting at, which is that even though that took place in the span of, the 3 days of Christ's crucifixion, death, burial, resurrection, ascension, Hades also exists outside of kind of time the way we experience it. So even though Christ despoiled Hades, that despoiling in time and space has to take place throughout the rest of the history of the church, right? In other words, the actions of Christ are outside of time and space. And the church fathers, when they talk about this, they explain the way to know this or prove this is that, the Old Testament saints, they're saved by grace, right? Abraham is saved by faith in Christ. Well, how could he be saved by faith in Christ? How could he have grace from Christ when Christ hasn't died yet? And the point is that, well, he's the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. In other words, when he did those actions, those redemptive actions, the efficacy of those actions can be applied even before they happened and after they happened, because it's an action outside of time and space ultimately.
Right.
It's an eternal sacrifice, eternal priesthood, etc., according to Hebrews.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. All right, yeah, really cool question. Next up, Gamer King. What's up, Gamer King? Gang.
Hello.
Hey, what's up?
Okay, so I had one question actually two questions. One of the main quote lines I always am appealed to, that people always use to argue that Orthodox are the schismatics after the Great Schism is the formula of Hormizdas. How familiar are you with that? And also, are there any resources I could check out about that?
Yeah, so I think Ubi did a whole video covering this. And if I recall, like many things in that time period, relied on forgeries. Isn't that right?
I'm not personally all that familiar with it. I just have seen it thrown around on the internet, and I was just curious.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's right. I mean, I see. So I'm trying to find Ubi's video on it. Yeah, so I think. Yeah, so he did a debate with. Oh, what's that Uniate guy's name?
Lakotas?
Yes, no, it's the other one. It's his debate with John Colarafi. They debate.
Oh, okay.
They debate the formula of Hermistus. So, if you just type in papacy debate, the Pope in the first millennium, John Colarafi versus Ubi Petrus, that whole debate covers that.
Okay, awesome. I'll check that out.
Yeah.
And then also one other question. So another common tradcath polemic that I hear a lot is the contraception controversy in Orthodoxy. Is there anything that I could check out for that? Or
yeah, Ubi did a whole video based on Dr. David Bradshaw's paper that I would recommend as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and I'm going to put the debate that I just mentioned underneath this chat for you guys over here on Twitter, so because I know a lot of people won't go look for it.
I appreciate it.
So right underneath the Twitter space is the first post that I just put there is Ubi's debate with John Colarafi, and a lot of the debate centers on that topic, if I recall.
All right, thank you, Jay.
Yeah, man, good question. Yeah, I mean, so many of the so-called, papal proof texts are things that nobody nowadays in Vatican Roman scholarship even cites anymore. like people don't even reference this stuff anymore. But a lot of trads don't know this, or they don't care because they don't listen to the Vatican or the last 60 years of the Vatican. So they don't actually care that even the Vatican admits that a lot of this stuff is forgeries and stuff made up way late that is intended to give the appearance of being some patristic thing, and they just charge forward as if none of this even matters when the rest of the world has basically moved on and doesn't fall for this trickery anymore. Kevin Barry, what's up, Kevin? How you doing? You gotta hit unmute. Also, Denny's book, Papalism, is really good as kind of a classic response to a lot of those quote mines. And I'm sure that there's a section in Denny's book on the formula of Hermistus. It's been a long time since I read that section. I don't remember what specifically Denny replies to that with. Kevin, Barry, are you there? Again, you have to hit unmute, dude. All right, we're going to move on. Austin. What's up, Austin? Hit unmute, Austin.
Yep, sorry, you were cutting in and out. I didn't hear you call my name.
How you doing?
So, pretty good. How you doing?
All right, what's up, man?
I have a, excuse me, I'm getting over the coof. I got a quick question. So I saw a clip from, I don't know how long ago it was. I didn't see the original, but it's Destiny and Tristan, their debate.
Okay.
From the clip, just context clues, I'm assuming it was based somewhere around the existence of God. So,
well, they had a debate about the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, so it might have gotten off into theism, but
got you. Well, it was just like a minute and a half clip that I saw, so it was totally out of context. Anyways, so Tristan, I guess, in that section of the debate had kind of a precept angle, and Destiny's critique was, okay, well, what if I tell you, 5 years ago, I'm butchering this is not verbatim. 5 years ago, God told me that, I can't remember exactly what it said, but I'm just the stereotypical is, God told me that he's a spaghetti monster or whatever. You know what I mean? Based on your own framework, you can't really critique my claim that God told me this because your entire belief system is based on, well, it's revealed by God. And I was just curious what your response would be, because this is my response that I heard from a video a long time ago from a Protestant preacher. But basically, the basis of our faith has been revealed through thousands of years and has been handed down orally and written in scriptures, or written by dozens of different people and places that are 100 miles away, yet they all have perfect continuity and fulfilled prophecies. And I mean, you know, you have authors writing young adult novels with less continuity, and it's the same person writing in like a 5-year span. Yes.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't go into all that evidentialist kinds of trying to convince them of the continuity of the text, because the argument isn't that it's just competing claims of various
revelation
of various deities. The argument is that the revelation of the totality of the Christian worldview and paradigm gives an account for and makes sense for metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. So Destiny has misunderstood what the argument was. He might have thought that Tristan was saying, well, it's true because God told me. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that it's true because the metaphysics, the ethics, the epistemology that the Christian paradigm provides is coherent, gives an account for reality, can give an account for justification of knowledge, objective morality, etc. And the other worldview can't. That's the argument. So he misunderstood the argument by replying that, oh, okay, well, God told me that my destiny worldview is true. Right? That's not answering what the actual argument is. It's ignoring it.
Got you. Because I've encountered that and witnessed that kind of.
Now
response.
you could
and
go.
It also has to do with, in the revelation, who and what God reveals Himself to be.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say you could go into that.
Monster, then it's not omnipotent. It's material. It's limited. Right. It ends up being sort of being that's not in a position to know, and couldn't solve the justificatory epistemic problem in the first place.
Right. Yeah, exactly. If you did want to go into the the actual history of the religion and what it's offering, somebody who just says, oh, okay, well, I have a God that spoke to me last night, and it's the flying spaghetti monster, and he told me that my worldview is true. That's not answering the dilemmas that we're bringing to the table. We're saying that your worldview doesn't answer these things, and the type of deity that you posit is what's going to either answer or fail to answer those classic philosophical dilemmas. Again, just look at the pre-Socratics, right? I mean, the pre-Socratics are all doing the same things that modern unbelieving thinkers and philosophers and Dawkins and Dennett and all these people do. It's the exact same thing. They're just repeating these ancient guys, and the ancient guys, they're at least smart enough to realize that, well, I need some kind of unifying metaphysical principle. I mean, today's thinkers aren't even that smart. They can't even figure that out. But the ancient guys are all at least asking the very questions that we are asking the atheists, right? The transcendental argument proponent is just repeating the problems of the pre-Socratics to all of these idiots who don't even know it. And I was just thinking about how many times in all these debates, people that don't even know what the one and the many is, they don't even know what's being asked when you ask for a unifying metaphysical principle. They think you're talking word salad. It's the very origins of philosophy.
Yeah, no, that all makes perfect sense. And yeah, I didn't really even consider the miss the point aspect of the entire exchange. Just, if you completely miss the point of what my argument is, your response is.
Yeah, so really if you did want to boil it down to competing authority claims, which is what was going on in that section of the discussion, I'm Tristan. I have an authority claim for my worldview. I guess if I'm going to do Tristan, I should do my hand like this. Oh, I'm Tristan, and I have an authority claim. I'm just joking, Tristan. My authority claim is the divine revelation from the Christian God, and then Destiny says, oh, well, I have a competing authority claim, and my authority claim is just the God in my head that speaks to me as the spaghetti monster. Well, the point is that as Father Deacon said, the God in your head, the spaghetti monster, is a limited, non-omniscient, right, material deity that can't answer the question that we're asking in terms of worldviews. How is that going to be a justification and a grounding for a coherent worldview by just positing some absurd thing? So it's just, again, it's missing the whole point, and none of these people even know what a transcendental argument is. They all think it's word salad, when you point out that, okay, so if X is a necessary condition of Y, Y therefore X, how is that word salad when it's a completely valid form of argument?
No, I totally understand that. I guess my question was, that answered my question, first of all, but I guess on top of that, their response to your response would be, well, no, I mean, the guy who told me he was God is omniscient. And then would it ever be...
Well, then that wouldn't be the flying spaghetti monster.
Well, I just use that because that's just something commonly said. He didn't actually say that in the video. I was just... Anyways.
Okay, well, so then you're right that at a certain point, like if they just started ripping off the attributes of the Christian God, like if they just started saying, well, my God is a Trinity. My God is a Trinity, and he's omniscient.
I'm sorry if I was unclear.
No, well then what would happen is, right, then it would be evident that they're actually just cribbing and ripping off the prior revelation, and at that point it would be useful to go into the fact that, we know that our revelation.
What's the origin? Here's our origin.
You're just getting it. You're just ripping it off from us. So
which is our point.
Which is that you're proving our position.
You're already presupposing.
You're presupposing our position.
You're presupposing the Christian position.
Right.
Your videos on Daniel, I believe, are like just blow that entire argument, that entire angle out of the. Just all your videos on the Old Testament, by the way, are fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, well, that's why I began tonight's talk by saying that most of the heresies, as in the world religions and then the Christological Trinitarian heresies, all of these come from two things. Number one, ignorance of the Old Testament for a lot of it, and then number two, word concept fallacies. So most of the heresies in world religions can be classed under those two mistakes.
Yeah, and just one more question. This is kind of a off topic, and if you don't feel like answering it, that's perfectly fine. The last question before I leave. A few months ago, you made a video about, I think it was titled "Why You Should Move to the South." And being a native Georgian, I just want to hear your argument. I'm from Savannah, so I do not defend Atlanta or anything that goes on in Atlanta. But I don't know if you've ever been to Savannah.
Because Jay hates Montana. That's why.
Well, I'd rather live in Savannah than Montana. How's that?
Montana's the south of the north, by the way.
Would you rather? Would you want? What if I moved in with Hannah Montana in Savannah or in Montana?
You could go to a Savannah Bananas game. The minor league team.
There's a minor league team called the Savannah Bananas?
Yes, it was a public vote. Just another instance of why democracy is a failure.
So you want to know why I would prefer Tennessee to Savannah, Georgia?
No, just you said you didn't like Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And now this is a total waste of time. This is total selfish question on my part. But this is something I'll get on Twitter just to ask him this.
Okay.
It was cracking me up in your video. And that's it. It's really not a serious question.
Well, a lot of the Georgia people have messaged me and being like, "Why are you hating on Georgia?" Well, I mean, because mainly Atlanta sucks, dude. I mean, I think I said in the video, Atlanta sucks.
It's terrible.
Yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of really cool, like country Georgia towns, though. I mean, I think I've been to Savannah once, so, and I think I remember it being pretty cool. Yeah, I don't have anything.
What the problem with Tennessee is?
Nothing.
Bell Witch.
Well, maybe we need to come down here. Maybe she's in Hades, and maybe her
doing exorcism on that house.
Well, her realm of Hades hasn't been conquered yet, so maybe the harrowing is taking place over time, and the Bell Witch just hasn't heard about it yet. So I don't know. I'm joking. Actually, the Bell Witch isn't far from. It's about 2 hours from me. So. But I've never actually been to the Bell Witch thing. Everybody talks about it, but I've never been to it. But I think every state does. Does Montana have one? Does Montana have a cryptid creature that you're supposed to watch out for?
Yeah, they're called liberal.
I was gonna say, is it like Skittles or something like?
Skittles, yeah. Which they actually look like demons now, so you can't.
So it's easy. It makes it easy to. All right. Well, hey, good questions there, Prime. Let's see. Kevin Berry is back. So what's up, Kevin? How you doing? Hit unmute, dude.
Hi, Jay.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Jay. It's a real pleasure to talk with you. I've been following you for a few years.
Thanks, man. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. So I've just been inquiring into Orthodoxy. I went to my first Divine Liturgy a couple weeks ago.
Cool.
Had a really very nice priest. We're going out to tea next weekend, answer some questions I have. It was a pleasant experience.
Is your priest British? You're going to tea?
Yeah, we're going to tea. I'm not sure if he's British. He's originally from the West Coast, though, Seattle. So maybe that's why.
I've never gone to tea except in the UK. So
what? What'd you say?
I've never gone to tea except in the UK.
Oh, gotcha. Well, yeah, I'm from Portland, and a lot of people go to tea there.
Oh, okay.
So,
I didn't know that. Okay.
yeah, but I'm in Missouri now, and that's where I met him. So.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so my question, it's kind of a broad one. I'm curious, when it comes from the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, how do we categorize which of the commandments from the Mosaic Law we're still supposed to follow and which ones we're not? Of course, we still follow like the Ten Commandments and many of the things that are really just about moral behavior and societal behavior. But I'm just curious, like, for example, why doesn't the Orthodox Christian Church do some form of the Feast of Tents or the Day of Atonement or things like that?
We do. So Day of Atonement is every Divine Liturgy. So the Feast of Booths is basically part of Pentecost. So the answer to your question is that the mind of the church tells us which and in what way we continue and how to keep the various Old Testament commandments. So in other words, the first answer, simple answer, is that we keep them all. Everything continues on, but we don't keep them in the exact same way as they were kept under the Mosaic dispensation. So the way that we know or how we go about determining the way that it's kept for the New Testament believer is going to involve quite a few things. First of all, it's going to involve the principles of hermeneutics in the New Testament itself. So how does Hebrews explain the Old Testament? How do the apostles, how does Jesus explain it? So we're going to look at all of that. We're going to look at the first serious council that happened in the church, which dealt with this issue, Acts 15. So Acts 15 answers this question by saying that in terms of explicit external keeping, all that's necessary for the Gentile to be engrafted into the church is what was expected in the Noahic covenant. In other words, if God could accept Noah as righteous on the basis of the Noahic commands, the Noahic covenant, we shouldn't require anything more of the Gentile converts to Christianity in the New Testament. That's the reasoning in Acts 15 at the Council of Jerusalem. Now, it doesn't end there, because the church, as we know, continues to define herself after the post-apostolic period, even before there's a canon of Scripture. So we can't just look to the canon of Scripture. We also have to look to the tradition of the church, and a big part of the tradition of the church is the apostolic liturgies. So the liturgies help us to understand which feasts and which celebrations continued on after the death of the apostles into the early church, and that's where we get some of these things like the Marian feasts and that kind of stuff. So some of that relates to tradition, but the answer is that the mind of the church as a whole throughout these centuries gives us a clear picture about how and in what way the various laws are continued over and are still kept. If you want more specifics, Lewis did a really good documentary he put a lot of time into at Orthodox Shahada, where he made basically a little documentary about Old Testament worship that's continued into the Orthodox Church, and it answers a lot of these questions.
Yeah, I watched that. I found that so fascinating. That's actually what made me finally go to the first Divine Liturgy I went to. It's a great video.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, so there's not like a, there's one book that has the list of the things that I keep and the ones I don't. Like, it doesn't really work like that, because, sometimes in the history of the church, canon law, right, will develop, which even references some of these principles from the Old Testament. So that's why there's not really, like, you might have a council in the 6th century that refers to principles found in the Old Testament or the book of Leviticus. And a lot of Leviticus, for example, is present in our liturgy. If you watch the interviews that I did with Seraphim Hamilton, in at least 2 or 3 of those long interviews, we went into quite a bit of depth about the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, how it relates to the liturgy. So you'll see a lot of that of those texts, Levitical texts, present in the Eucharistic offering, for example.
Yeah, I love that. I think continuity is such a strong argument and way
Absolutely.
of understanding where God's truth is preserved. So
I was
really
just thinking about like
things.
literally all the Muslims in the world, they just have no conception of the Old Testament. They're completely lost. And they have no idea what's even in it.
I made a good Muslim friend like 8 months ago, and I wanted to go to his mosque and learn all about what they believed. And I was just wowed by the really cartoonish caricatures they have when it comes to Christian beliefs. And then, they're complete ignorance about really anything found in, say, Leviticus or Numbers. That's fascinating. I guess just one last thing I'd like your general thoughts on. Just studying church history, and I find the Quarto-Deciman controversy and issue so interesting, that how John and Polycarp and all of them over in the East were doing Easter according to the date of the Passover date in Exodus, but Peter and Paul seem to have instituted to do it on Easter Sunday, and the Sunday one won out, I think, in Nicaea and stuff. Why was that the apostles had like a different understanding of how to celebrate Easter or the Lord's Resurrection Day?
Well, because for one, in some cases there was the intent to distinguish the church from Judaism, right? So the church wanted to explain that we are not rabbinical Judaism. So, for example, we do honor the seventh day in the Vesper service. So if you go Saturday night to church, there is still the honoring of the seventh day. But
really?
Yeah, it's in the service, right? So we still keep the Ten Commandments, but what I'm saying is that, but that's not the day of the resurrection, and so the Sunday is more significant to the Christian because that's the eighth day, the day of resurrection. And so likewise in the Quarto-Deciminarian controversy, that was, at least if I recall, a holdover of a kind of Judaizing tendency. And you'll notice if you read the book of Hebrews, the book of Galatians, there's quite a bit of struggling with the relationship. Can you mute for a second if you're not talking? It's really loud banging. It's okay. So there's a need at a certain point to, on the one hand, say in what way we're in continuity with the Old Testament, but also to distinguish the worship and the praxis of the church from what is beginning to be in these early centuries rabbinical Judaism. So rabbinical Judaism develops after the diaspora when the temple's destroyed in 70 AD. There's already a tradition of rabbis. I'm not saying that comes from Ezra, but what I'm saying is that what we now today know of as rabbinical Judaism develops out of this diaspora post-temple destruction period, where it starts to become something revolving around the teaching primarily just of the rabbis and the oral traditions of the rabbis, which also can be written down, right? So you have the Babylonian Talmud, you have the Palestinian, there's different Talmuds even. So that's a different religion. I think in some of these cases, the church wanted to just set a line and say that we're not that. And the same thing happens with the canon of Scripture. Rabbinical Judaism eventually says we're not going to go with our own Greek texts, right? And so they reject the
Septuagint?
Yeah, and go specifically with, we don't know if it was the Masoretic, but it's called like a Proto-Masoretic text. So they go with, right, their Proto-Masoretic text. We don't know if there's a Council of Jamnia, but some people think there was a rabbinical Council of Jamnia, to not go with whatever the Christians are using, basically. So both groups kind of go their different directions.
Right. Yeah, and that's where you see stark changes, like Isaiah 7:4.
And so a lot of these things, what you're talking about, like why are we doing Easter this day? Why is there a feast to Mary in the early church, and this kind of that develops in the liturgy? That's because we believe in tradition. So we're not Protestants. We don't think that the only basis for why we do things has to be some written text. That's typical. And most of the time, the Judaizing groups in the early centuries of Christianity, they had some form of that kind of a thing. We're like, where is this in the text? Where is this? So we see amongst the Judaizers, we see kind of a proto-Protestantism, and then that's why a lot of the Protestant reformers were actually also called Judaizers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean they even said the reformers even said we don't want to use the apostolic text. We want to use the rabbinical Jewish Masoretic text. I mean they were big on that.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Luther is huge on that. That's what exists.
Yeah. When if you've read Luther's debate with I read that whole debate, and I've read but Luther's writings to him, and then the Catholic guy's response to Luther. I forget his name. What's his name? Eck. If you read Johann Eck's critique of Luther, I mean, he basically
say Cogiton, but
no, it's Eck. He says you're just a Judaizer, which is ironic because Luther was not into Judaism at all, right?
He wasn't a fan of him.
Right, but Eck was arguing that your desire to use Masoretic texts makes you a Judaizer.
Yeah, he definitely didn't like that, I'm sure.
No, they hated each other, yeah.
Okay, hey, one last question, Jay, and then I'm going to stop hoarding all this time. I know with both Catholic and Protestant history, you find, for example, like the Crusades are a common one, John Calvin killing Michael Servetus or ordering his death, or however that went about. I know that there's been persecution of heretics in a bloody and violent way in a lot of Catholic history in the medieval ages, and even with the Protestants and how they were very close to killing each other, and some of them did. I'm curious, what's the Orthodox Church's history when it comes to the idea of persecuting heretics, and just what's the Orthodox view on history like that?
Right. So the ancient canons leave this up to the state, and so you do have times when Christianity permeates an empire or a state, and it becomes the state religion, that the church can leave it up to the ruler to exercise his judgment. So there have been times, after the Code of Justinian, where you had exile. I've read that there have been periods where there was even in certain, maybe not for heresy, but for certain actions like death or murder, kill, like certain Skittles actions, for example, might be punished in certain ways under the Code of Justinian. So the Byzantine Empire had I wouldn't say that it was equivalent to the Roman Catholic notion of the sometimes used medieval Dominican idea of auto de fe, where you burn the heretic. I don't know that any Orthodox people really did that. But there were banishments. So sometimes heretics would be banished from the empire or the imperium. So the church fathers call for that. Augustine, if I recall, is the first one to say that heretics should have state force used against them. He's kind of pioneering in that regard, but it's also at the time when the empire was beginning to be more and more Christian. So there's not an easy flat out, the church doesn't say we should burn a heretic or anything like that. But in a Christian state, the imperium has the authority to punish heresy. And that's something that did exist in Byzantium, but not every emperor necessarily had the same types of punishments. Some might be more lenient. So there's not a one-size-fits-all, because typically the church and the state, they're two heads of the eagle, right? It's a two-headed eagle. So the church doesn't tell the state that it has to do this. But if the state is too lenient, then you can have your whole empire overrun by heresies. And at times in the first 1,000 years of the church, the empire was almost completely taken over by heresies, right? Like Arianism or iconoclasm.
Right, yeah. Well, so what is from what I'm hearing is that the Orthodox Church, if there was a serious heresy problem, generally the worst they would do is banish them away. Is that what I'm understanding, or did they ever, like Muslim nations do today, would they ever put heretics to the death simply just?
I don't know all of church history, so I can't say there may be some place where a Serbian king had I don't know. I'm not aware of that being normative. I'm just saying that
that's all I'm looking for. What's normative?
What I'm aware of is, and again, I'm not a historian, so I know, but what I'm aware of is that there was banishment of heretics, imprisonment, but there could have been cases where an Orthodox ruler put heretics to death. But that's But my point is that there's a separation of church and state, and so the church is saying we hand this over to the because you have the same thing, for example, in the canons of Saint. Can you mute, please? It's echoing.
Sorry.
So in the canons of Saint Basil, you have a statement where it talks about if anybody kills a fetus, they're liable for murder, right, or they're liable for death. But it doesn't mean that the church doesn't put them to death. In the church's view, you are putting yourself to death by removing yourself from the Eucharist. So you undergo a canonical penalty in canon law. Our understanding of, for example, stoning to death the sinner is what happens when you remove yourself from communion for sin. That's how we understand those Old Testament texts, for example. Now, in a society, hold on. So in a society that has a predominantly Christian belief system or government, where you have like an Orthodox king, the church would hand the person over to the state, and then the whatever the state's laws are would determine, whether that person would be imprisoned, banished, fined, whatever. And there could have been a time when a heretic was put to death.
Gotcha. All right. Well, hey, I don't want to take up any more time.
Yeah, good questions.
Jay, thank you very much for your time, man, and thanks.
Yep, thank you, dude. Good questions. So Sidonitus, you can. I don't really want to do the whole crypto talk. You're welcome to ask anything you want to about this stuff, but tonight we're not going to talk crypto.
Hey Jay, how you going?
What's up, man?
Yeah, I just had a quick question.
Sure.
So I could be misunderstanding what a dialectic is, and that could be where I'm stuffing up here. But you know how you always say that orthodoxy transcends the dialectic, so to speak, right? And especially when it comes to the one and the many, you'd have like Catholicism and Islam, for example, they're more on the side of the one. Hellenism as well, and then you'd have, I don't know, say polytheists or whatever on the side of the many.
Sure.
But whereas we're the both and because of like the unity of the essence of God and the multiplicity of the Trinity. But isn't that still a dialectic in the sense of it's like either or versus both and? Isn't that also a dialectic, or would that be like a paradigm level dialectic, much like paradigm level circularity? Does that make sense?
What do you mean? Restate that. Isn't what either or?
So
you're saying is it both and a dialectic?
No. So you're saying because you always say it's not a either or, it's a both and in terms of the one and the many, right?
Sure.
But then isn't that just pushing it back a step and it be like, so either or versus both and, that in itself is also a dialectic from which you have to choose. Like,
no, that's
why not?
Right. That's not. So the difference between dialectic doesn't mean it's not saying that it's not equated to either or. It's equated to a false either or. Two different things. So for example, if I said, well, either God exists or he doesn't exist, right? A sophist could come along and say, aha, well, see, that's a dialectic, because really the truth is something in between, that God does and does not exist. No, there's not a dialectical tension. That's misunderstanding what a false dialectic is. There are dialectical either ors, right? I mean, okay. Incest is not right.
She's either pregnant or she's not.
Yeah, so it's not to say, oh, it's a false either or because you can be half pregnant. No, you're either pregnant or you're not. God either exists or not, right? So false dialectic is not the same thing as dialectic.
Okay, so when you say God transcends the dialectic, what you're really saying is he transcends these false dialectics.
Yeah, the world religions have false dialectics, right? And so the pre-Socratics are the greatest example of this, with all of their whole philosophy is the dialectic of either or. God, right? God is either all things or no thing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because I don't think I've ever heard you categorize it as false dialectic as such. You just
no. I've said many times that's not true.
Oh, wait a minute.
That's not true.
Yeah.
It's not true. I've always talked about false dialectics.
What do you mean?
It's just another. It's kind of another like way to show a false dialectic in terms of what's called a complex question. So
I see.
You can sometimes things seem intelligible. So when you're reading through the philosophers and the Greeks, it's like, oh yeah, that seems intelligible. That's either the one or the many, and that they're opposed. but it's not intelligible. It's really kind of a category error, where you set these two things in opposition to one another when they don't have to be, or there's a third option or something like that.
Yeah, and it's also not true that I haven't made that clear. I've talked about this for at least 15, 20 years, and I've always pointed out that it's a false dialectic. So if you misunderstood that, that's possible.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. I said, like, I me personally, like, I never picked that up. That's
now,
I was trying to say you've never said that.
I may not have, every time I've discussed this topic, used the word false dialectic. I might have said at times, like, this is a dialectical tension that's not necessary. That's equivalent to a false dialectic. It means the same thing. So, for example, in the course that we did the other night, we had this very same question come up. So let me give you an example, because I just spent about 2 hours 2 nights ago covering how there's different senses to the word dialectic, right? Because people in the course were getting confused because they said, well, I've heard people say that Plato taught using dialectics, and I thought dialectical methodology is how we learn things. There's totally different senses of what we're talking about here. False dialectic in the sense of metaphysical tension and contradiction is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the problems of the one and the many, the problems that we encounter when we have these strict Unitarian views or absolute divine simplicity or Hellenic views. That's talking about a metaphysical problem of dialectical tensions that may be false either ors. God's either one or he's many. That's a false dialectical either or tension. That's what I mean. I'm not talking about dialectics as pedagogy. Totally different. Plato, Socrates, they use dialectics, meaning a dialogical question and answer process, sometimes called the Elenctic method. Nothing wrong with that. That's how we all learn. But this is a great example earlier, not saying you did this, Sidonitus, but in the class, people were getting confused. And I've had people many times say, what do you mean by dialectics? Because you're confusing me. And I've always tried to stress this. I always try to explain that I'm not talking about, there's not one sense to the word. Dialectics can mean a metaphysical position that is a contradiction, or it can just mean pedagogy, a teaching style. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with question and answer teaching style. That's what we engage in all the time on this we're using it right now. We're doing dialectical teaching style.
No, that makes perfect sense. No, all good. Yeah, like I said, it probably just confused me because I wasn't really, I didn't really have any philosophical training in that particular sense.
No problem.
When it comes to dialectics, and so that's really helped clear it up. I had another question as well, which is totally unrelated to this. But I recently watched a few of your videos on the problem of evil, and one of the questions that came up was like slavery and things like that. And I just wanted to know, because I was thinking about this the other day, would you say that slavery is objectively morally wrong, or would you say that it's more nuanced than that?
Well, in the ancient world, there were different types of slavery. So some slavery was like indentured servanthood. So that's why people use the term chattel slavery. And there's different classifications of what counts as slavery. And I mean, by even standards of 100 years ago or 200 years ago, like people in America that are wage slaves have it worse than, quote, slaves. So, I mean,
Exactly.
Is wage slavery count as slavery? I mean, it really just depends on the various historical manifestations of slavery. So if we just mean like poverty and indentured servanthood, I don't see how we can say I mean, that's just a feature of this world. So is it evil? I would say the church fathers typically would say that it's an evil that exists in this world, just like warfare is an evil that exists in this world, but it's never going to be completely gotten rid of, if by gotten rid of we mean that we'll have perfect equality and nobody will be in poverty and there won't be any wage slaves or any. I mean, that's probably in this life never going to go away.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Like the line between slavery and poverty is a very thin one, and I think one of the ways we can think about it is like, well, as someone that's like in poverty and that has to work, well, the only difference between me and a slave is that, well, if I so choose, I could just starve to death and not have to work, whereas the slave doesn't have that option. But I'm not really sure that I should have that option. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Being
Well,
slothful
so
like
I think,
that.
right. I think Lewis is trying to put together a video where he spent the last several months actually diving deep into this issue because he wants to respond to the Muslim view about, slavery in the Old Testament versus the New Testament and the church fathers' takes and all that. So Lewis, I think, will be probably going way deeper on this issue than I've ever gone. So you could look for his coming video. But for those that are watching, I do want to, again, draw this illustration because hopefully this helps clear stuff up, because people get really confused over this. They don't know what I'm talking about. Let's look at this graph that I always draw to help illustrate this. And we're going to use the Greeks as an example. So this is typical amongst a lot of the Hellenic thought, particularly in the philosophical schools of the pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle, and the Neoplatonists, right? This will be true for most of them. And so let's look over here on this side of the graph. This is what I mean by a false either or metaphysical dialectic, okay? I'm not talking about teaching styles. I'm talking about metaphysical dialectics. So we have to understand what metaphysics is first. What do the Greeks typically think metaphysically was the case about this side of the graph? This is a better status, higher status, true status, good, etc., right? Those are the things that characterize this side. This is what we want to shoot for according to the Greeks. We want to shoot for the good, the highest ultimate good, the one, right? Because it's eternal. It's one. It's in pure stasis. It can't change. It's pure being, etc., etc., right? These are the things that are good. And this is true of the pre-Socratics, some of them at least, not all of them, because a couple of them believe that the ultimate principle is the many and not the one. But let's say for the ones that are monists, right? Monists, Plato, Aristotle, and the Neoplatonists will agree with this whole system here. Now, this is in a tension with, there's a fundamental, what do we mean by tension? A fundamental contradiction, fundamental battle going on between these principles in reality. That's what I'm talking about here. And so for the Greeks, the opposite of these characterizes our reality, right? What's the contrast? What's the opposite of the principle of the good? It is the bad, which is time, many, or particularity, flux, and non-being. Do you see that these are the opposites? This is a table of opposites. And Bradshaw demonstrates in his Aristotle East and West book, in the chapters on Aristotle, that Aristotle also agrees to this table of opposites type of view, that these things battle each other, right? Time is like a lower, diminished status of reality that kind of battles with eternity. The many is trying to return back to the one. That's a Neoplatonic idea, right? Flux, Plato says, characterizes this reality, and it's bad. It's a shadow dream reality that really points us to perfect stasis, perfect being, the one. Okay? These are in tension. They're not in harmony. And Orthodox Christian theology, the Christian paradigm, does not believe that. Even if Roman Catholic absolute divine simplicity proponents are too stupid to realize that they believe all of this, that all this Hellenic stuff, and that all this Hellenic stuff precludes the Trinity and the Incarnation, because guess what? All the heretics just repeat these same dialectics. The Christological heretics and the anti-Trinitarian heretics. God can't be three because he's one. God ain't in time, he's eternal. I mean, I was just reading Copleston, the Jesuit, saying that how could you say God's in time? It's impossible. Well, then there's no incarnation. So they don't even realize that their philosophic statements preclude the incarnation in their own systems. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about false dialectics, metaphysical. That's all I'm talking about. That's it. Right? This is what the Greeks think. And that's how we critique the Greeks. In fact, Copleston himself in the book, as a Jesuit, even offers critiques along the same lines. He says, for example, well, Plato, if everything's one, then how do we even get the many? Copleston critiques Plato by saying that Plato has no answer to that question. Likewise, if everything is one, he critiques the pre-Socratics. Well, then how did we get so many minis? These are dumb dialectical presuppositions. Even though we can appreciate the Greeks, we also have to point out that this is foolishness. What does Basil say about Aristotle's unmoved mover duality? He says it's foolishness, it's stupid. So we can appreciate the questioning of the Greeks, a lot of intelligent, creative minds, but at the end of the day, the Greeks are still stuck in a foolish, autonomous, dead-end, dumb position, and that's why everything the pre-Socratics are saying, from Thales to Pythagoras, no different than today's atheists and materialists saying the exact same dumb things. Something came out of nothing. No, it didn't. It was always there. And then it gave birth to man who crawled out of the sea muck and just became man by his own. I mean, it's just silly. It's mythological. So the irony is that even though we think of the pre-Socratics as moving away from myth, moving away from Homer and Hesiod, they're still mythological. They're still positing these outlandish metaphysical doctrines, which is actually more consistent than today's modern atheist philosophers who think that they're not doing metaphysics, but they're positing completely absurd magical worldviews that the Big Bang, something just came out of nothing. At least the ancient Greeks understood it was metaphysical and that they were doing metaphysics. Today's people are so stupid. They think they've rejected metaphysics while they make wild, insane metaphysical claims under the guise of science. Anyway, good question, Sidontis. Let's move on. Iron Age Hyperborean, what's up? I can't see the full name, so it just says Hyperborean.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, what's up?
Hey, yeah, so I have some like really quick, easy, they're not even like questions or arguments. But so as some context, I'm a Reformed Protestant and kind of been looking into Orthodoxy the past year or so.
Uh-huh.
So I kind of understand the continuity thing where, the church in its beginning kind of exists as Orthodoxy today. But I don't know a lot about like the different councils and what councils determine what. Is there any like books or lectures or something that you would recommend for that?
Yeah, so I mean, you sound like usually Reformed people are pretty serious about it, and I would say you could go into the route I took, which is to read Yaroslav Pelikan's series. So read the first two. So the first one is the history of the Christian tradition, and that will cover the first 6-7 councils. And then volume 2 covers Byzantine and medieval philosophy and theology, which will get into iconoclasm and Byzantium. And that's great because it's not just restricting the discussions to history. Pelikan does a great job of doing history of ideas. So the first 2 volumes of Pelikan are the best for that. That's how I actually started this when I was beginning to take patristic medieval classes back in 2001. I read that series. Pelikan series was really good. So that's the place I would start to get the overview, because he's going to go through each, not just of the councils, but actually the figures and the heretics and what the heretics were saying. And to read the first 2 volumes is not too taxing. They're both about 280 pages each. I also do have lectures on I think I did a lecture, 4-hour lecture on the first one. I don't think I've done a lecture on the part 2 yet, but if you wanted to get more specific in terms of Orthodox takes on the councils, you could read Meyendorf's book, Byzantine Theology, because even though that's about Byzantine theology, it's actually a theology of the councils from the Byzantine perspective. So it will include, the conclusions of Nicaea as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's some great recommendations because I'm kind of just looking for an overview of those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I mean, Pelikan wrote that as a Lutheran before he became Orthodox. And the advantage of that is just simply that the Pelikan Christian Tradition series is pretty standard in seminaries across the world, academia. So they're pretty well-known standard academic texts, and they're not geared towards, I think Orthodoxy is obviously true, but I'm saying if you want an objective or striving for objective approach, read the first 2 volumes of Pelikan, which I read as a Protestant and then became Catholic. Not because of that book per se, but I'm just saying that I was reading that in those phases of my life. And then if you want more of a specific Orthodox perspective, the Meyendorf Byzantine theology text would be good, because he also focuses on councils and heretics.
Okay, awesome. Pretty much the only other question I have is the theological concept of the energy's essence distinction. I haven't looked into it at all, so if you could give like a brief overview of like what that is and why it's important that there is that distinction, and like what it answers,
Sure.
that would be awesome.
Yeah, I can. Father Deacon, would you mind stepping in here? I got to actually go to the potty. I got to pee really bad, so I don't know. Father Deacon, are you available?
I do mind.
How would you?
I guess it's
How would you answer the question of what exactly is the essence energy distinction and what's it getting at?
Yeah, so I read something recently that I thought was really good. I'm trying to remember if it was it Losky? No, it wasn't. Where did I read this? Forgive me. Anyways, was reading some Orthodox theology, and it was saying that the difficulty that the West has had because of everything Jay and I was saying, that early on the Latins married themselves to Greek philosophy. The West could not conceive of a mode of God existing apart from essence. So if we start with that's an unjustified, untrue statement, then we could say, well, God exists in the mode of his essence, and then also in the mode of his energies, which the Greek word is energeia, which could be activities, doings, actualizations. St. Maximus also talks about the things around God is the energeias. The word energeias, even in the Gospels itself, is just, it gets further discussed, and it becomes clear to us exactly what that revealed doctrine is as you go through the Palamite theologians and up into Maximus. And Maximus says the things around God, the logi, is the plural of logos. So if you think about, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and all things were made through the Logos, and nothing that was made was not made through the Logos. The Logi belonged to the Logos. And I know I was teaching a catechesis class on this, and you can kind of think about it is, it was talking about that you could, in an analogy, think about God the Father is thought. And every thought has a word, and the word expresses the thought, but the thought is the principle of the word. And this becomes an analogy, obviously, for the way that we do things with thought and word, and the symbiotic relationship with the Father and the Son as well. So anyways, if we think about this, through the Word, the second person of the Holy Trinity, all the things that are made in the logi, the energies, but that's not the essence of God. That's the things around God. But what we would say is, but it is God. It's just not his essence. Does that make sense? So you follow me so far? I just have to set up some kind of preliminaries. So God can exist in two modes. In himself, in his essence, which no word, no thought, no concept ever reaches or penetrates. So it means all talk about God, even talk about his essence, is through and pointed at and directed and talking about his energies. You follow me so far?
Yes, I do.
So it means his essence is radically apophatic. That's why Losky says he must transcend transcendence. Like, once you even get to apophatic words, it's like, it's beyond that. You're still within the energies. And so everything we say about God is talking about God, but in the mode of his eternal activities. Is what we would say.
I would add to not just his eternal activities, but also the activities in time, because not
That's
everything.
right too, because there's that. Yep.
Right. So, for example, the cloud and the fire, right? Those are actions that God did in time and space and history, and they came and went. And so we would say that even though that was uncreated, God has the ability to transcend the temporal categories and not just do eternal things, but also do things in time and space. For example, when Jesus changed water to wine, that was an action proper to the divine power, but it happened in time and space. It came and went. Jesus isn't. He's not eternally turning.
Good.
He's not eternally turning water into wine. He's not eternally walking on water.
Yeah.
But he still did those actions as a divine person, displaying the divine power in time and space. And St. Gregory Palamas calls these. He talks about these as specific types of energies that God can do in time, even though they're uncreated. They are temporal. And that doesn't require change in God, because God, the essence of God, doesn't change in any of these actions. But God can do changing different things, right, via the energies. And so this is another.
And notice they're not just the effects of God. So
no, they're divine actions, right?
Where God's really present there.
Right.
He's really walking on the water.
Yeah.
And also, I would say too, that's what's really important. The essence and energies are intimately connected too. They're not separated. They're not mediated by anything. Why?
Right, so,
because they're God.
Right. They're personal actions of God. In other words, the analogy of the Cappadocians is the building of a house, right? So if I build a house, that's an action proper to me as a human being, and every energy or action proceeds from some nature, right, that has that energy or action. For a human being, there's an energy proper to human nature, a created human energy that goes into building a house, and I'm fully present in the action of building the house. I'm not reducible, though, to my action or to my nature, because I'm a unique person, and person stands above nature. It's not in a dialectical tension with nature, but it's distinct with and more than just a nature. This is why we do the Trinity. This is why we have a Trinitarian doctrine, right? Because the three persons share a nature, but each person is distinct and more than just a nature. If person was reducible to nature, we would be modalists. We would believe that there's only one God who manifests that one divine nature as three persons. But that's not what we believe. There's three distinct persons, and that nature is communicated from the Father to the Son, and from the Father to the Holy Spirit. So it's a very different triadology than what you typically have, not just in Roman Catholicism, but also in Calvinism, because Calvinism kind of defaults to an Augustinian Trinitarian theology. But so the analogy is that there's a distinction between nature, person, will, energy, and effect. If you read John Damascus, book 3, chapter 15, he goes into a lot of detail explaining and helping to illustrate this distinction between nature, person, will, energy, and effect. Nature being the human nature I have in this analogy. Person being I'm the particular person, J, who has that human nature. Energy being the action proper to my nature to build a house. Will being my decision as an agent to build the house. The effect being the house itself. All those things are distinct in Orthodox and patristic theology, not just to account for human nature and human anthropology, but to account for the Trinity in Christology. All of these things go together. Our Trinitarian theology is what grounds the nature, person, will distinction in Christ.
And they're not just katapanoia too. They're not just
they're real distinctions, not
they're
just
real
mental
distinctions. Yeah.
And a lot of Roman Catholics, like Thomas, for example, these are purely conceptual distinctions. They're not really in God. No, they're really in God, because we're really not modalists.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks. That really answers it. So yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, great questions. And then if you want to go deeper into the essence energy distinction, we always recommend read Dr. Bradshaw's essays. Essence energy distinction. What kind of distinction? Essence and energy. What kind of distinction? And then he has another paper called Divine Glory. Both of those are really good for the essence energy distinction. And then if you want to go really deep, you read Aristotle East and West, which is a difficult book. So I'm just going to warn you. It does require some philosophical knowledge. Johnny Moore, what's up? Thank you guys for those super chats. We'll get to those in a second. Johnny Moore.
G'day, Jay. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. How you doing?
Well, it's an honor to talk to you. Really, it is.
Thanks, man. Are you an Aussie? Sounds like an Aussie.
Bloody oath, mate. I'm from Australia.
It's an honour to talk to you too, mate.
Yeah, mate. Put another prawn on the barbie. Not shrimps, mate. Don't bloody get confused by whole.
Okay.
So,
What's on your mind?
I wanted to ask you, right?
You there? You're cutting out.
Yeah, are you there?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm very interested in orthodoxy, right? Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so what happened is I've noticed that there's a large number of Westerners converting to the Orthodox Church. So that includes even here in Australia.
Right.
I'm a traditional Catholic, but sometimes I go to an Eastern Divine Liturgy. And when I went to a Ukrainian Greek one, for example, right, they I feel like they have pews like Roman Catholic churches, so they might be more Latin influenced, right?
Now, is this a Uniate church or an Orthodox church?
Well, it's a Uniate church.
Okay.
So a Russian Catholic church. So we have the only Russian Catholic church which came from Russian Orthodoxy. It's one of the smallest Uniate churches. It's one of the smallest Uniate branches in the Catholic Church.
Okay.
But they don't have pews there, for example. So I just I wanted to ask: is there different traditions like that are carried on from the Orthodox Church? Like, do Greek Orthodox churches, do they have pews, and do Russian Orthodox churches have pews?
I think really this depends on Latinization. So, I mean, I haven't been to Greece, but I would imagine in Greece they probably don't have pews. Maybe some of them do.
They don't have pews.
Yeah.
It's an American.
So that's more
It's an American thing.
Yeah, it's a Western thing.
You'll also notice with the Greek Orthodox here in the United States tend to wear collars.
Yeah.
And that was something that was adopted when the immigrants were coming over, that they thought that, we could blend in more, we'll see as clergy. So there has been a lot of, I'd say most of that stuff happened in America by adopting certain Latin things to kind of blend in because they felt so much like outsiders.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I'm so used to there not being pews that when I see pews, it's weird to me, right? Like, some Antiochian churches have chairs and pews, and when I see that, I'm like, oh, that's weird, because I'm so used to the Russian churches, which don't. So, but I mean, I think those are just kind of like Latinized things that usually happen in America. So
would you say the Russian Orthodox Church is the most traditional out of most of the Orthodox churches?
Well, I don't think that those kinds of influences are the biggest deals. I mean, there's things way more important than pews or not. I mean, but so, I guess a simple answer would be probably. I mean, but I mean, you can have problems in Russian churches too. So it's not like I'm trying to be some kind of like jurisdictional purist, like, oh, only the Russians have it right. I mean, it's not really like that. It's more so, I mean, really in America, it's just really a parish to parish issue. But you can have I mean, obviously the Greeks are the worst overall and everything. So in America.
Okay. So I just have two more questions for you. So the next one is, because I'm very attracted to the Byzantine liturgy in Eastern Christian traditions, I feel like, I don't know, it just offers me something that hasn't been there before, because I used to go to Novus Ordo masses.
Right.
I became lapsed. I was sort of an agnostic in my teenage years. When I was 19, I started going back to church, coming back into the faith. And the Novus Ordo, I had to keep finding Novus Ordos because some of them were preaching what would have been considered heresies back then.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I had one Novus Ordo priest tell me that you could believe in reincarnation and go to heaven and be a Catholic,
right? But
that's clearly the case. And then another priest at another Novus Ordo told me that Jesus' natures were both separate from each other, but they're united in hypostatic union. And doesn't that sound like Nestorianism to you?
Well, I mean, the first statement is separated, yeah, but if he affirms the hypostatic union, then that presumably wouldn't be. But I mean, I guess that's ambiguous. We need to know more. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if, I mean, the Novus Ordo is full of all kinds of heresies. But I would add too, in your case, and I'm not trying to judge you or be rude, but like, it's not like you just find an Eastern tradition, right? I mean, in our view, you have to have the Orthodox faith. Uniates don't have that, because you can't have the Orthodox faith and the papacy. That's not the Orthodox faith. So even though Uniates have elements of orthodoxy, that's not the Orthodox faith, because the Orthodox faith can't have this additional earthly head and the doctrine of created grace and the doctrine of the Councils of Trent and Vatican I. And if you go into a Uniate church, you're still supposed to believe in all those Roman Catholic dogmas, even though you're a Uniate. So it really doesn't make sense to be a Uniate. It's actually one of the best arguments against Roman Catholicism, in my view. And David has a good video on that, like how Uniates prove Roman Catholicism to be false. But the real point is that it's not looking for an Eastern tradition. It's the Orthodox faith that is the answer, not some generic Eastern tradition that Uniates and Orthodox share.
Yeah, that kind of actually makes sense, because in the Uniate churches, they don't recite the Filioque in their creed.
Yeah, so in the Roman Catholic Church, there's two.
If I were to recite the creed without the Filioque as a Roman Catholic, would I, by default, be an ex-Catholic?
Well, the point is that how can this church that is supposed to provide unity have two different creeds? It just doesn't make. It's dumb. It doesn't make any sense. And the mere fact that they allow for both shows that, well, somebody's got to be wrong and somebody's right. It's a default admission that the Orthodox were always right, because everybody knows that it was the later papacy that changed it, right? Because prior popes had said, don't change it. The creed, I'm saying.
Yes.
Okay, so we're the people that have the unchanged creed. You guys changed it. I mean, it's kind of like a, simple disprover of the papacy is the point.
Yeah, I don't know about that one.
Why not?
Because I don't know, I just haven't looked into that more.
Well, yeah, look up Pope John and Pope Leo and the change that occurred between them from one pope saying you can't change the creed to the next one saying, no, you can add Filioque.
Yeah, okay. I'll definitely look into that as soon as we're done. I just have one more question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I wanted to attend an Orthodox church, am I allowed to do that, or will they boot me out because if I tell them that I'm a Catholic, it's only for the Orthodox?
No, you can attend. You just can't take communion.
Right. Okay. Yeah, well, I'll definitely look that up, Jay. Thank you for having me on. It was really good talking to you.
Right. So if you do look it up, it's Pope Leo III, right? And so this is known as the Silver Shield of Leo III, and it's still at the Vatican, and it's the creed without the Filioque. And if you want an article, it's brought up in the famous encyclical, the Eastern Patriarchs of 1895. I will put that in the chat here, and then I'll try to put that underneath the chat here. So just look up the encyclical of the Patriarchs of 1895, and they bring up the whole issue of the papal shield of the creed. So good questions.
Will do. Very much.
And for those of you that are listening, I am putting that article right underneath this. Everybody should be familiar with this. Everybody should have read the Patriarchal Encyclical of 1895, because that's in large part responding to Leo the 13th and the papacy. So what the papacy was saying about Vatican I, the Eastern Patriarchs wrote this basically an apologetic response to the papacy, which, by the way, I mean, for the super pious Orthodox people who think we shouldn't do apologetics, I mean, have you not read the Patriarchal Encyclical of 1895? Because it's an apologetic response to the Leo the 13th. All right, so what's up? We got 500, over 500 people tonight. Welcome, everybody. If you would hit like and share. We are going to do super chats here in a little bit. We got some really generous people tonight. Thank you guys so much for those generous super chats. We will go to those in a second, but we got quite a few Q&A people here still. Modern Theocrat is next up. What's up?
Hey, Jay.
Yes, sir.
So I just have a quick question. I'm doing RCA right now. I'm trying to get into it. My question for you is I have two questions actually. One is, do you is the patriarch Krill, is he like your pope?
No. So in the Orthodox Church, every patriarch is just a canonical privileged title. So they have certain privileges within their jurisdictions, but there's nobody in the Orthodox Church at all that is anything like a pope in Orthodox theology.
Okay. And my second question is, have you ever debated or will you ever debate a Talmudic Jew on anything, on religion or anything like that? And if you have, where can you point me to it?
So the only Talmudic debater that ever came into the Discord was Yossi, and it was the exact same conversation that he had with Sam Shamoon. The only other Talmudic Jew was Duvid, and Duvid wanted to debate Freemasonry, which I didn't care about. So that we haven't had none have ever come.
I saw that. I saw that Nick Fuentes debate you had with him. That was actually, you did really well on that. I think that was the only debate that, although I disagree with you, I just think that was the only debate I've seen him lose, or he didn't do so well on. So I give you probably pro all this kind of stuff, and like all this weird positive stuff.
Well, I mean, a lot of that exists, but a lot of that exists in Rome too. So like that can't be the issue.
No, yeah, I know, I get it, but I saw Catholicism as like tradition and hierarchy and order, and kings and queens and monarchs and all that kind of stuff. That was much better.
Okay, but that's
like
it.
Small government.
But that's in Orthodoxy too. So.
I'm sorry.
But all those things are in Orthodoxy too.
Yeah, and I also saw that Jesus said to St. Peter that you are the rock for which I built my church on, and a few other things like that. So.
Yeah, but if you look 2 chapters later, he says the same thing to all the apostles.
Okay, I have not read that, but I will check that out.
Okay, yeah, check out Matthew 18. Good questions.
All right, thanks so much.
Yeah, man. P Divine. What's up, P Divine?
Hello.
Hey, what's up?
Yo, what's up? Hey, I just tried to get on. I'm a catechumen, Orthodox catechumen. Thanks to you.
Cool.
I just had a few questions about tag.
Okay.
I get the point of it not being circular because we have to assume stuff. We have to assume universals or assume at a paradigmatic level to prove anything. But I'm still kind of not grasping assuming God, and then I was just wondering if you could maybe walk me through that.
Can I say something real quick before I have to take off?
Sure.
Think about it this way. We all assume stuff. So ask yourself this. Do the things that I assume, do they do the work that I want them to do?
Oh, that's a good put. Yeah, it's well stated.
So, for example, what I want them to do, the work, is to provide a justification criteria. Just start to kind of introspect into that and say, well, what are all the things that I assume? And you'll start to realize, and I teach my classes.
Hey, P Divine,
simple questions.
P Divine, mute when you're not not talking. Can you
ask
mute?
Simple questions. Why is that a justification, and how? That's what I'm teaching my epistemology students. I'm like, you can just boil it and make it, because some of the stuff's really difficult. I'm like, make it really easy. Just ask the question. When a philosopher says something, or when we assume something, say, is that a justification, and why, or how? And what you'll start to find is it's not. It's just arbitrary. It doesn't even do the work. It couldn't be. So you're left with the alternative. Well, what would be the only other thing that could possibly be a justification for our justifications? That's a better way of putting it, I think.
And so
that would be God, right? In his revelation.
Right, so that would be justified because it is coherent?
Well, that would be part of it.
No, not just coherent, because we're going over in coherentism. You could come up with something that doesn't relate anything to reality whatsoever, but it's coherent. In other words, just make a fantasy story. So coherence by itself is not a justification. In fact, you could come up with multiple contradicting coherent theories.
Yeah, we're looking for...
What we do know, the opposite's definitely not going to be a justification. If it's incoherent, you can count that out. So what you start to look at is, well, wait a minute. God's revealed to be infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, personal, capable of doing all these things, not in the same epistemic quagmire that we are. Why? Because the sort of question-begging and vicious circularity is due to the finitude and our inability to be in an omniscient, a non-bounded kind of, a finite state. God's not that. The story that he gives is coherent. He'd be the only one that could possibly give a kind of criteria for the justification criteria. It explains all the things that we want to have explained. So what you start doing is you list out these things. It's like it's abductive, in the sense that it is the best explanation, right? And it ends up being the only explanation. It is coherent. It has explanatory power. And it's the only thing that possibly, even theoretically speaking, could serve to be a justification for our justification criteria. All of those things together ends up being, it's the only way you can go, right? That's why I said, just ask yourself, what else do you think would be possibly a criteria for justification? And you'll find it fails.
Okay, thank you. I had another one.
Yep.
About, I know you've heard of about Messianic Judaism, but in what ways have the fall holidays of Messianic Judaism, such as Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, how have they been fulfilled, and how are they celebrated within the Orthodox Church?
So, like the Day of Atonement, you're asking?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Yes, yeah, so if you read the book of Hebrews says that the fulfillment of the Day of Atonement is when Christ ascended into heaven to the heavenly throne and provided propitiation for our nature in God's throne, heaven. So the meaning of the high priest walking into the Holy of Holies and sprinkling it with the blood is symbolizing Christ's descent into the third heavens, right? The Holy of Holies was the third place that you could go from the outer portico inside the temple and then the Holy of Holies. That's 3 layers, 3 levels. Paul says that corresponds to Christ ascending to the third heavens, God's throne, and making atonement for our nature. So the keeping of the Day of Atonement is basically every liturgy, every Sunday.
Okay. And what about the Feast of the Trumpets?
Isn't that related to Pentecost and in gathering?
I would suppose so. And what about the Sabbath as well? I know, we still believe it's on Saturday at the Orthodox Church. Believes it's on Saturday, but
well,
why is that?
So the Saturday Vesper service still honors the 7th day. Like if you go to church Saturday, you'll honor the 7-day Sabbath in the Vesper service. But it's not the focus of our liturgy because the 8th day is the day of resurrection. That's the Lord's Day in the New Testament.
Okay. And one more. Do you have any good books on the historicity of the Orthodox Church being with the continuity with the Apostolic Fathers, with the Apostles, and the Church Fathers with the Apostles?
I think Father Stephen DeYoung's book is about that, right?
Father Stephen DeYoung?
His book about the early church was about that continuity. Yeah.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Yeah, and then I have a lecture that I did about continuity Old Testament, New Testament, Bible contradiction, ? So if you search Bible contradiction, J Dyer on YouTube, there's a 3-hour lecture about continuity that'll come up. That's probably the one you want. Good questions there. All right, let's see who's next. Evan. What's up, Evan? We'll go to a few more questions. We got still several people in line, and we'll do the super chats here in a second. Hey, Evan, what's up?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Good to talk to you. Anyway, so I had a question about Nestorianism and as it relates to Reformed theology. I am Reformed currently, and so I'm wondering, what resources maybe I could look into better understand it, because I guess I've read Peter Martyr Vermigli's on Christ's two natures, and I'm not quite understanding how he falls into the Nestorian category. Have you ever read that before, or?
No, I mean, I'm mainly speaking of the way that a lot of modern Calvinists speak. Like, for example, if you read Herman Ritterboss's commentary on John, like, he makes explicitly, I mean, he doesn't use the word Nestorian, but he talks about two different persons, the person Jesus of Nazareth and the person of the Logos. So, I mean, that's one example of a modern Calvinist that's explicitly making Nestorian statements. Now, remember, a lot of people will say that, well, I'm not a Nestorian, and they, with good will and intention, do not intend to be a Nestorian, but they might still have elements in their theology that are Nestorian. Maybe they don't even know it, right? So to be really clear on what Nestorianism is in the Orthodox view, according to Ephesus, it's defined as a dual subject Christology. So any kind of dual subject Christology counts as Nestorianism. And when I make that argument, I'm typically, not always, but I'm typically talking about the Reformed, the classical Reformation view of what happened on the cross. And if you believe in, this idea of the penal sanctions being poured out upon Christ, which is the classical Reformation view, then that's going to be, by implication, either Arian or Nestorian, depending on which way you go with it. So, in my view, that tells us that the Reformed view of the atonement is simply not true. But in other ways, the way I argue that Calvinism and the Reformed view as Nestorian is that there's no, if you don't have the doctrine, if you don't have the teaching of the Fifth and the Sixth Council, which is that the humanity of Christ is deified by the uncreated energies, then you don't have a true union. I mean, you can say all day long, Chalcedon and Leo, but that's not the last, there's more to it than that. The Fifth Council is an answer to and a specification of what happened at Chalcedon, because Chalcedon didn't say enough about the nature of the union in the sense of the person of the Logos who has the human nature and what his relationship to the human nature is. That's what the Fifth Council covers. And the Fifth Council is very clear, utilizing the terminology of the Leontii, that the humanity of Christ is deified because it's inhypostatic. It exists in the mode of the Logos who assumed it. And then it makes very clear in the Sixth Council, which gets more specific about this, that the uncreated energy of the Logos deifies the human nature that he assumed. Now, that was already stated in Ephesus, but there's a lack of clarity between the time of Ephesus to Chalcedon as to what exactly the union is and what exactly is going on. So in other words, at the Fifth Council, this is called the Neo-Kyrillic view. So the Fifth and the Sixth Councils reaffirm and restate the Kyrillian interpretation of Chalcedon, that you have to see it primarily as a union of the person of the Logos that deifies the human nature. And that's stated specifically in the Sixth Council. And there is no Calvinist that I've ever heard of who talks about the uncreated energies of the Logos deifying the human nature, because at Ephesus, Cyril makes this argument from the Eucharist, and certainly a Calvinist is not going to make that argument.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, that was a lot to take in. So one of the things, I attend a Reformed Baptist church, and they would subscribe to the Second London Baptist Confession. Mm-hmm. One of the things I noticed in the confession, it talks about how on Christ the mediator, it doesn't really focus on how Christ, I guess, he only really, it seems to emphasize how he mediates according to human nature. Obviously, because that fits into the scheme, I guess, as you were kind of alluding to, if I've understood correctly, that it's kind of like he only mediates as it relates to penal substitution. So essentially, the divine nature really does nothing, if you will. So I guess in that sense, would that be splitting Christ?
Well, it could, but I think the key point that's not really grasped in Latin theology typically, and particularly in Calvinist theology, is the distinction between nature and person. So, for example, the key issue that is hashed out at Ephesus is that the Logos is a divine person, and what he assumes is not a human person or a human subject, but a human nature. So he's fully human in his nature, but he's not a human person in any sense. There's no created hypostasis in Christ. That's what gets condemned at the fifth council specifically. And the reason they do that is to exclude any possibility of Nestorianism. So the purpose of the fifth council was an attempt to, it was a reunion council with what are called the Coptics, or the Oriental Orthodox, who believe that Cyril was contradicted by Leo and Chalcedon. So the purpose of the fifth council was to specify even further beyond what happened at Chalcedon. And just to be honest with you, my understanding, I think I know this topic very well. Most of the time, Reformed people and even people in the Latin Church in general, they're pretty much frozen at Chalcedon. They don't really know the debates and the discussion and the purpose of the fifth and sixth council. So they don't actually understand why it even matters or what the purpose of it is, because, well, don't we all believe in the hypostatic union? Yeah, but what exactly does that mean? And the purpose of the fifth council, again, is to stress that it's not natures that do. It's persons that do, that have natures. That's key. So it's not two natures coming together that make the person Jesus. It's the divine person of the Logos who already has his personal agency from all eternity as the second person of the Godhead, assuming human nature. Thus, as Cyril says, the only subject of all the incarnate actions is the divine person of the Logos. That's why he's a divine person, and that's why the debate of Ephesus is over the term Theotokos, that Mary is the mother of God, meaning a divine person is who she gave birth to. Doesn't mean she caused his divinity, but the debate is over whether there's a single subject in the person of Christ or a dual subject, human and divine. He's not a dual subject. He's a single divine subject with a dual nature, human and divine. So we have to understand, in terms of Christology and Trinitarian theology, the importance of mode. Mode in theology, not modalism, mode is crucial for Trinitarian theology, and it's crucial for Christology. This is why we use that term inhypostatized. The divine nature is inhypostatized, which means it exists in the mode of the three persons that have that nature in the Trinity. Likewise, in Christology, both the divine nature and the human nature are inhypostatized in the divine person of Christ. Not a human person in any sense at all. And that's why they called Nestorius a new Arius, because he introduced a human subject, Jesus of Nazareth, right, who was united in a special way with the second person of the Godhead, the Logos. So to have a Christology where one person of the Trinity dies, is damned, is cursed, is cut off from God, you either have to be an Arian and believe that it's a human person that's being cut off, or a Nestorian, right? Or you have to deny the Trinity and believe that the second person of the Trinity was cut off from the Father and damned, because the classical Reformation doctrine is that Jesus is damned for us.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, even today when I was at church, I don't know if it follows with this, but I heard that, I don't know that, like, the pastor didn't emphasize that Christ went to hell, but he did emphasize that the wrath of God was poured out upon him.
Yep.
And when he said that, because I've been studying the subject just a little bit, I kind of cringed.
Yeah.
Only because
Good.
I guess it's like,
I'm
the more
glad
I
you
understand
cringed.
it, I'm like, that's Nestorian.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And if you want to go deeper specifically on how this idea is Nestorian in terms of not so much penal substitution, but how it would leads to that, I would read the book St. Cyril of Alexandria and the Christological Controversy by John McGuckin. Because once I really understood Cyril's debate with Nestorius, this pretty much solved all of this Christological Nestorian stuff for me. Like any remaining elements, I mean, I was already a Catholic when I read that book and looking into Orthodoxy. But any of the remaining accidental Nestorian assumptions that I had kind of got swept away. So because it's a really good book. I don't agree with everything John McGuckin says. Unfortunately, he's really liberal, but just from a academic standpoint, that book lays out the essence of the whole debate. And once you understand that, it's like, well, I can't. This pretty much cancels out all Reformed theology. Period.
Well, and I guess to make one last statement, I don't want to hog it for everybody,
Sure.
but I guess one of the difficult things I find about Reformed theology, and as I've broadened out and started to study Eastern Orthodoxy, I find it extremely difficult. Essentially like the reformational doctrine of like sola fide. I find it difficult because in terms of church fathers, they don't teach it.
Yeah.
And it's such an emphasis in the Reformed Church that essentially if you deny sola fide, you have another gospel. And I guess I kind of scratch my head and say, well, what did the church do for 1,500 years?
Yep. Well, you're asking all the right questions, and I'm sure you are on your way to becoming Orthodox, because these are the questions that lead people right out of the Reformation view. I mean, really, all five of the solas. I mean, the only one that we could agree with is by grace alone. Yeah, okay, we agree that salvation is really ultimately just by grace. I mean, we didn't have any claim to this. God doesn't owe us this, but sola scriptura, sola fide. I mean, these are really problematic because, I mean, you've got really famous, even Protestant scholars, world-renowned Protestant scholars who are not even super liberal, like Alistair McGrath, right? He wrote that famous book, Justitia Dei, talking about how nobody taught sola fide until Luther. I mean, Luther's really the first to teach the Protestant classical Reformation doctrine of justification by faith alone. Okay, well then, if that's the linchpin of the church and the gospel, then the church didn't have the gospel for 1,500 years.
Well, yeah, and I guess too, I mean, you kind of see the fruits of Protestantism to some extent, because when you think about it, they just believe whatever they want. So what I'm finding though is like a lot of people, I affirm Nicaea, but you don't affirm baptismal regeneration. It's like, how do you?
Well, they don't. Yeah, I mean, they don't really affirm Nicaea, because Nicaea isn't just the creed; it's also the canons that come with it. And the canons talk about the episcopate, they talk about holy days, fasting, Lent, bishops, real presence. I mean, that's all in the canons of Nicaea. So they don't actually. They just take the. It's like what you said. Your pastor was talking about Christ receiving the wrath of God. When I was in my Calvinist church, and this question came up about Christ's descent. That's just reinterpreted to mean that he bore the wrath of God. And it's like, well, but the church fathers say that it's his harrowing of Hades and him going into the domain of Hades, preaching the gospel to the dead. And I've never heard a Reformed person say that that's what it is. So,
well, and just so you know, for future reference, there's a gentleman, Baptist, Samuel Renahan. He has, I think, a book called Crux Mors Inferi, and he openly admits that Calvin essentially reinvented the wheel. But what he also does is he affirms the classical, or I guess the historic understanding. So I just wanted to point that out if you ever want to read that, so you could,
Of which thing? The death or the descent?
Of the descent, yeah. But he doesn't say that he suffers in hell, like I think you alluded to Calvin. So the book would be called Crux Mors Inferi by Samuel Renahan, and he explains it more in the sense of what you just said. So.
Okay, well, I mean, there may be outliers. I mean, you can always find in any of these traditions an outlier who, I mean, for example, you could find amongst some of the reformers people that had a view of the real presence that was almost what we would consider the real presence, right? But I mean, the point is that, from our vantage point, yeah, that's nice and all, but like, so what? Like, that's, just because you can find an outlier who comes close, like what we need is the full thing. Like, you can't have, for example, Christology without deification, because deification is grounded in the idea that Christ deified the human nature that he assumed. And you can't have deification of the human nature without the uncreated energies that deify that nature. So, you can't have that without the essence energy distinction. So I'm not trying to be rude, but I'm saying, just because like a Baptist dude happened upon the descent of Christ into Hades, okay, that's nice, but like, that's not enough.
No worries. I mean, I wasn't trying to, put that out there to say that they're completely correct. I was just saying, like, there are reforms that are affirming it. Well, anyways, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, good questions. Absolutely. Yeah, check out that book, Christological Controversy, by John McGuckin, on St. Cyril and Ephesus. And I highly recommend that. It was a great read. I read it as soon as it came out back in the day. Julia, what's up, Julia? Julia? All right. Well, I guess Julia's not there. Let's go to the super chats. We got quite a few here. Dell, $1,005. Jay, are you familiar with Whiteheadian process relational pantheism? No, I'm not. A Whitehead, like Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy? Yes, I'm loosely familiar with that. I'm not well versed in this philosophy, but I'm familiar with it. If the peripatetic axiom is indeed found in the senses, but it's not, does that mean that its axiomatic constituents are lost? I mean, the peripatetic axiom is that there's nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses. So the axiom itself obviously isn't in sense data. So I think I get what you're going for, but my point when I bring that up is just that even on their own grounds, they can't make sense of the peripatetic axiom. Gamers stank ass, $20. Funko Pop books, Funko. Oh, thank you so much, Gamer stank ass. He knew what kind of a handle to use over here on my side of things. Samwise the Brave, Mr. Frodo, here's $3. I recently watched the Jeff Badonkadonk stream on Netflix. Y'all know who Jeffrey Badonkadonk is, right? I was surprised to find out that he was baptized when John Wayne Gacy was executed. I did hear that Dahmer had undergone a Protestant conversion experience, which I mean, I actually had heard that a long time ago. I didn't know it was on the same day as John Wayne Gacy was executed. I don't know if there's any significance to that, but there could be. I never heard that. Is it possible for somebody to repent like the thief on the cross, who's a killer? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thief on the cross could have been a murderer too, right? So who knows? But yeah, I think murderers can repent. Now, just because you repent doesn't mean that you're not gonna, face the death penalty for your crimes, right? So it's not like, oh, I'll repent and suddenly I'll like Jesus. I guess I don't have to go to the death penalty anymore. I'm free. It doesn't work like that. You still have to face the penalty. But in my view, if we had more of the death penalty, a lot more people would be repenting. Anonymous, $1. What were Neanderthals? I don't necessarily think there were Neanderthals. So if in fact, if you look at the history of a lot of these so-called Piltdown Man, Nebraska Man, they're all fakes, dude. Admitted fakes. And it's not accidental, by the way, that Teilhard de Chardin pops up at multiple of these fakes. And somebody, Kotel just did a stream where he covered I don't know this guy. He's a Catholic dude. What was his name? Eret. It was a really good article. I shared it on Twitter, and he was going deep into Teilhard. So we have to give props to this Catholic dude from Canada. Let's find that. It's about not only Teilhard as a con man, but also transhumanism coming out of, here it is, found it. No, this is not his article. This is some interview. I'll find it here in a second. So his website, here it is, Canadian Patriot. Let me find his, you have to scroll down to find the actual article though, because it took me a while to find this the other day. By the way, I don't know Canadian Patriot, so I don't really know anything about what he talks about other than this article on Teilhard that he did was really good. All right, where's it at? So this is worth it. By the way, it's worth me finding this for you because it's really good. Because previous to this, like, it was really hard to track down the articles about Teilhard being involved in all these paleontology frauds. Oh, here it is. This is it. No, is that the one about Canadian history? Here it is. Found it. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Transhumanism and the Cult of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This is it. And he goes deep into the how Teilhard popped up at all these fraudulent Piltdown Man, Nebraska Man. And, I mean, it's pretty obviously, you're right, like he's involved in this, in concocting these frauds. So, that's where we get this idea of the Neanderthal man. It's from all this fraud bullshittery. Anyway, so, and Teilhard was a complete quack, dude. I mean, this guy was nuts, if you don't know. Right. So we've covered Teilhard before in multiple talks. I mean, these evil Jesuits, they were totally involved in the promotion of not just Big Bang, but also spreading the... they were like evangelists for Darwinism. And Teilhard, actually, it's not surprising. He was like a committed total eugenicist, right? Which is kind of weird because, like, the Roman Catholic Church, right, supposedly is opposed to eugenics, right? But, and I know that for a while Teilhard was on the banned books list, but now he's not. I don't think anymore. Like, now he's cool, right? The Vatican likes him, which makes perfect sense. I mean, he's like a perfect modern day Vatican type of man. But if you want to go deeper into this article, I'm going to give it to you right here. Really, really good article. Really well done by this Catholic Canadian dude. Not Canadian Catholic. That dude's crazy. Different guy. And so I just put it underneath this chat on Twitter, and I put it into the chat for you guys. It's a must read. Really good expose of Teilhard, transhumanism, Great Reset, and all the frauds. Unkiss My Assassin, $3. I'm a Virginia law student for a nonprofit. I've already got a grooming man person out of a library. Would you be interested in a public debate on what? What I can verify myself. To debate what? What about this channel do you see? I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not being a dick. I'm just saying, like, I don't understand what in your field of what you're doing in terms of law that has to do with the topics that we cover here. But I appreciate you reaching out. J Tub, $3. What is the difference between a dichotomy and a dialectic? Well, a dichotomy is just a distinction, right? Or a contrasting. Dialectic, in the sense of metaphysical dialectic, is principles in intention. So distinction doesn't necessitate tension. Well, Emmanuel, $5. Not so false dialectics. Either you super chat or you quote the Dyer guy in Crucible Debates. I don't get that one, but sounds cool. Dean Lim, $2. Or excuse me, I appreciate your super chat. Well, Emmanuel, I'm not trying to be a dick. Dean Lim, $10. Is there a distinction between energies and virtues? So we can speak of different types of virtues, like human virtues ultimately relate to divine virtues, but there might be created virtues, right? Like created human virtues, kindness, mercy, right? And then those direct us to the divine energies and divine virtues. Maximus says that ultimately all the virtues point us to Christ, who is the source of all virtues, both created and uncreated. But there is a distinction between created energies, which humans have, and uncreated energies. And so our purpose is to combine our created human energy with, synergize with the divine energies. This seems to be important where there's a lot of virtue signaling. Well, I mean, most of the people who do virtue signaling, like the normies and whatnot, they can't even tell you why something is virtuous or what that even means. Right, so yeah, it's definitely a good point. Dell, $1,003. Jay, why do Christians accept evolution? Well, for many reasons. For one, loads of indoctrination and propaganda from people like Teilhard de Chardin and Jesuits. The most powerful, wealthiest people have promoted and funded evolution from the top down, from the Royal Society for a couple hundred years. It has the appearance of explanatory power. I don't really think it does, because people oftentimes confuse different terms with, quote, evolution. Sometimes they just mean that species adapt. Well, okay, well, that's what it means, and everybody believes that. But the idea of a transmutation of one species into another, which nobody has observed or can prove, and in fact, the evidence suggests that that doesn't occur, they'll do a bait and switch and say, oh, you believe in adaptation? Oh, well, then you believe that, whales suddenly print bear code, which they don't. So, there's probably spiritual reasons why people default to believing in evolution. It's a delusion. People think that it's sophisticated and scientific. There's tons and tons of reasons why. Why do Christians say that magic does not exist? Well, if people believe that they have magical powers, most of the time they don't, and it's a delusion, and so in that sense it doesn't exist. But if you mean by magic like extrasensory perception or these kinds of things, well, that does seem to exist in some cases. So, but the powers that the shaman and the voodoo practitioner claims to have, they typically don't have. So they're under a demonic delusion, but they might have demonic inspiration or influence, which does exist. And so in that sense, magic does, and in another sense doesn't exist. What are your thoughts on trick or treat or truck or treat? I don't know what truck or treat is. Is that some like trick or treating with truckers? That sounds pretty dangerous. Candy cane. Also, can you review the movie The Craft? I know that movie's pretty lame. I'm sure it's a bunch of goddess feminist propaganda. So, but it probably did have a cultural impact in terms of opening people's ideas up to witchcraft, because it's got like Nicole Kidman and Sandra Bullock, and I forget who else is in it, but it probably does have a cultural significance for opening people up to witchcraft. So maybe we should talk about it. Anonymous, $3. Can we adopt philosophies or political beliefs or ideologies or doctrines if they are in accordance with Christian doctrine? Again, it depends on what the philosophies, beliefs, and ideologies are. If they're in accordance, then presumably, yeah. But I would need to know specifically what they are to see if, in fact, they are in accordance. For example, what if I identify as a rationalist? No. I don't think rationalism is in any way compatible with Christianity. Who are the rationalist philosophers? They're all pretty much incompatible with Christianity. Authoritarianism in terms of the state. Well, again, authoritarianism is kind of an ambiguous term, because that could mean monarchy. That could mean a dictatorship. So we got to be more specific than this. Big state capitalism. I don't think that's in accord with Christianity. Where in the history of the church in any Orthodox country did you ever see big state capitalism? So what about adopting aspects of Aristotelian and Stoic philosophy? Some of the church fathers were influenced by Aristotle and Stoics, but again, we have to be more precise than this, than to just kind of have these generic phrases like authoritarianism or capitalism or Aristotelianism. We got to be more precise, because elements of Aristotle are not compatible with Christianity. Give me one more super chance. $150. Wow. One more super chance wins the night tonight with that big fat super chat. Much appreciated. Thank you so much. Those are the super chats that really help us keep us going. And guys, I want to remind you that if you want to support me, the best way to do that is to head on over to our show sponsor, the beloved, the best, the greatest on earth when it comes to supplements, Choq.com, CHOQ.com. That is the show sponsor. They've been our beloved sponsor for 1 year now, over a year. And everybody loves Choq. I've seen all kinds of comments in the past couple of weeks. Multiple people, YouTube, Twitter, everybody's talking about how much, even on my Instagram, they love the Choq. They're like, Jay, are you busting out these amazing hits from Choq.com? Yes, that's the secret. And so if you're looking for the best way to add to your daily regimen of nutrient adaptogens, right? We don't get a diet that's really nutrient sufficient. It's deficient. So if you want to make up for the deficiency with sufficiency, then head on over to chalk.com and get a hold of the Action 2.0 if you're looking to boost that overall energy level that you're lacking. Head on over to chalk.com and get a hold of some of that. What else they got that's great? Irish moss. Ladies, if you want to balance out hormone imbalances, Irish moss is great for that. Actually, Jamie does take that. The daily is great for overall supplementation if you're looking to just try something overall. If you're looking for mental focus and clarity, She Legit actually does work. A lot of keto carnivore people are really getting into the She Legit right now. I'm a big fan, as you guys know, of the Tonkat Ali, which is proven to boost testosterone. There's also other great mental clarity geared things like the ashwagandha. Get yourself some ashwagandha. Like I said, my favorite is the Tonkat Ali, which does boost testosterone. And the promo code that you have to use is J50, JAY50. That gets you 50. That give you a recurring subscription with more of a discount. So if you want to set up a recurring subscription because you think, well, I want to get these coming on the regular, I don't want to have to put the information in every week, every month, whatever, use the promo code J53Life. That's JAY53Life, JAY53LIFE. That gives you 53% off, and you also get those supplements coming every month, and you don't have to put all that information back in. It's an easy way to do it. Jeffrey Bezos does that over on the Amazon, right? The recurring subscriptions. Well, so does chalk.com. They also have 7 Wonders. They also have the organic cacao beans over here. And then they also have the superfood, the chocolate, which literally tastes like chocolate, but it's a great addition to your smoothie regimen. So use the promo code J50 or J53Life to get chalk.com. All right, let's get to the next super chat, which is Austin Lee for $5. I have a question about ecumenical councils. I asked on Twitter, what makes a council ecumenical? Well, in the Orthodox view, it kind of depends on different times, right? Because ecumenical for a long time referred to the empire. And so when the emperors called the councils, right, and then the church eventually throughout the various dioceses of the world received that teaching and accepted it, eventually it achieved the status of ecumenical. But just because a council occurred and a lot of people were there, or even the emperor was there, or even bishops were there, didn't necessarily make it, quote, an ecumenical received council. So, for example, the Orthodox Church, there's the 8th council, and then the 9th council is the Palamite synods, which are universally received throughout the world. And so they're also, quote, ecumenical in the sense of being universally received, even though there's no longer a Orthodox empire or a Byzantine emperor. So councils can be universally received and achieve that same kind of authoritative status, even if they weren't ecumenical in the sense of the patriarchs all being there and the Pope being there and the bishops and the emperor being there. We don't think that the Patriarch of Rome is necessary anymore, right? Because he's removed himself from the church. So and by the way, even the Roman Catholic attempt to answer this doesn't actually answer it, because they have changed the listing of their councils over time, right? The Lateran Council, for example, there's no reason why in the Roman Catholic view it shouldn't be one of the ecumenical councils, and yet it is still not considered an ecumenical council, even though according to the Roman Catholic listing of what counts as an ecumenical council, the Pope approved it, should have been an ecumenical council. And yet Lateran is not, and yet they can't even tell us nowadays if Vatican II was. I mean, I think it's pretty clearly an authoritative ecumenical council, but a gigantic chunk of half of the Roman Catholic Church believes it is not an ecumenical council, even though their Pope has approved it. So again, just illustrates the practical absurdity and practical unworkability of their own system, which is supposed to be the easy one answer, one size fits all. This is how we know what an ecumenical council is. You have a Pope. Okay, but if you actually get into church history, you actually learn and you realize this is not really as clear as the Roman Catholics make it out to be. Why do a priest disagree with Ubi Petrus? I don't know who disagrees. You're talking about Jerusalem 1672. Okay, well, that's not an ecumenical council, right? So in the Orthodox Church, it's not like the only thing that's binding is an ecumenical council. So they might disagree on whether Jerusalem 1672 is universally received. Typically it is. But the fact, by the way, that some people disagree doesn't disprove orthodoxy any more than people in the Roman Catholic Church itself disproves the Roman Catholic Church. Depends on what the argument is being made. So if a Roman Catholic's arguing that we have a pope, so therefore it solves this issue, if people are disagreeing, then it shows that it doesn't solve the practical issue. Because usually Roman Catholics are making this argument on the basis of practicality, right? The papacy practically solves these problems on a practical basis. Okay, but you have a bunch of people that disagree. So did it actually solve it on a practical basis? So why do some people disagree? Because people have historically disagreed. That doesn't mean that the position isn't correct. Nanana, $5. How can Orthodox Christians debate biblical truth when both assume their tradition interprets the Bible correctly? Oh, Orthodox and Roman Catholics. How can they debate when they both assume the tradition? Well, but that's two different questions. So the fact that both people have assumptions doesn't mean that they're both right. So the question is, whose tradition is right and whose tradition is wrong? Do you have to resort to sola scriptura? No. I mean, if I'm debating with a Roman Catholic and we're debating the question of was the papacy operating in the first millennium according to Vatican I principles, that has nothing to do with sola scriptura. And if you look at the various debates and discussions that we've had with Roman Catholics for years, I think you'll find that we've had many of those debates that didn't have anything to do with sola scriptura. Anonymous, $1. Can you explain philotism? This is the idea that your ethnicity is above the universality of the message of the gospel. It makes sense for the Russian Orthodox Church to have authority over churches of Russian immigrants in the United States rather than falling under an American Orthodox Church that has no connection to Russian believers, right? Well, the jurisdictions have to do with expatriates. So no, it doesn't make sense for there to be an American Orthodox Church, because America is a weird, unique case where if that happened in America, everybody would be put under the Greeks, and the Greeks would be telling Russians what to. It's a nightmare. It wouldn't make any sense. So no, we wouldn't want that. Carson, $50. Do you see the Orthodox versus Gnostic debate on the Crucible? No, I did not. So not being rude, or I'm typically busy. I'm teaching a course, as you can see. I mean, we're working through, hundreds of pages of philosophy texts here to teach this philosophy course. So no, I don't have time to, watch everybody else's content and debates. Doesn't mean I'm dissing them or that I don't like them or anything like that. I just don't have time to watch all these debates. No. So there was a Gnostic guy named Spirit Man. Haven't heard of him. He has a strange infatuation with you. Well, okay, well, that's kind of weird. So it would be hilarious if you debated him. No, I'll pass on that, but thank you. Gaben McGaben, $5. Hey, Jay, big fan. Will you be doing esoteric reviews on shows like Sandman and Euphoria? No. Modern stories are heavy, even modern story heavy video games? Probably not. It's funny to hear you shit on the soy content. Cheers, mate. Well, thank you. Yeah, I can't really, a lot of that stuff, I don't enjoy it at all. I know people watch it and make YouTube videos, but it's like, it's kind of annoying for me to watch it. Rachel Wilson, $10. Thank you for everything that you do. Your body work is so important and deserves as much support as we can give it. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. Appreciate the kind words there, and appreciate that super chat. P. Divine, $5. God bless you for answering my questions. Well, thank you, P. Divine. You didn't have to super chat me, but thank you for that. David, $1. I'm just sending you some love, no questions. It's not very much. I need that mixtape. Yeah, well, everybody asks when you're putting these on Spotify. Everything that's on my RSS feed for podcasts goes to Spotify. So all the stuff is on Spotify. So you guys can make your own playlist on Spotify. I haven't put the new song was really weird, right? That one was really crazy. I think I lost about 20 subscribers after I posted that, which that always cracks me up because it's like, I've been putting up goofy content the first videos I ever put up in 2006 on YouTube were just ridiculous things. And I've always been putting out ridiculous stuff. So it's weird to me when people are like, what is he doing? What is this? Unsub. Okay, I don't care, right? Like, I've always been doing this. So, if you're new to this, I don't just talk about one thing. I think people are used to one-dimensional people on YouTube. They only talk about psychology. They only talk about philosophy. They only talk about no, I've been always talking about all these topics and doing the goofy stuff. So, if you're mad over the Simpy Simp song, okay, get mad. Fine. I'm not going to stop doing the goofy content because you're weirded out, but I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Who's next? Let's see. Strasbourg, $3. Is the doctrine of Trinity logically coherent, or does it transcend the laws of logic? It's both. So it is logical because it is something that grounds logic in our worldview, the possibility of logic at all. For example, the one in the many, which is necessary to do logical predication and distinctions. In our view, the Trinity grounds that because it solves the problem of the one in the many. But the Trinity is also not equivalent to or reducible to logic or logical categories, because for us, the logical categories are features of the created order. So even though they reflect God, right, or one of the divine rays, logic, they're not equivalent to or reducible to divinity, in the sense that God is not synonymous with the laws of logic. He is more than the laws of logic. Think about it like this. Let's say I was a really good mathematician. I'm trying to think of an analogy because people always find this part confusing. Let's say I'm a really gifted mathematician. I'm Matt Damon, Matt Dadbod in that movie where he's a math dork that's a janitor or whatever. And I write out some really fancy mathematical equations. And they're things that I discovered or, quote, came up with, right? And they're true. Let's say that I'm true in these mathematical, formula or whatever. Does that mathematical creativity and thought process come from me in this analogy? Yes. Right. So I'm Matt Dad. Remember in the movie when Matt Dadbod's like, he's mopping up student vomit, and then he goes in there and writes this gigantic equation on the chalkboard. Remember that? Does that come from Matt Damon? Yes. Is Matt Damon reducible to the math equation on the board? No. Right? He's more than that. But it does come from him. So in the same way, God, math and logic are reflections of the divine mind. They come from God. But God is not reducible to or equivalent to the laws of logic. And for some reason, so many people, they think that he has to be, or that it has to be this way. I don't know why. It's silly. Brock Brunch, $15. Ortho Catechumen here. I see how theistic evolution is not compatible with creation. How do we account for the distinct stratification of species by order of complexity in the fossil record? Why would that be a problem? I mean, I think that if there's speciation, which is, whoever the primordial dog was, right? I mean, dogs of the varying kinds would be, variations that the varying types of dogs are adaptations that created the speciation from whatever that proto dog or wolf was. So, and many of them would have died over the years and become fossils. So I guess I'm just not understanding what the problem or the objection is from theistic evolutionists or from evolution theory proponents about that. But I mean, the main problem with the evolutionary story from my vantage point, my critique, is there is absolutely no proof or evidence of a transmutation of species. So even this objection, like, how does it lend any proof or credence to that? Bean, $5. I spoke to you at St. Herman's. Yes, I remember I talked to a lot of people there. I don't remember who Bean was, but I trust that you were one of the people there. What do you think of Jonathan Pageau's monolatry, where all universals are gods and angels? I didn't know that he had that position. I don't know if that is his position. If that is his position, I would disagree with that. I don't think that we would equate universals to angels, but I don't know if that's his position. If it is, I would disagree with that. It seems necessary if the energies like being and divinity are omnipresent. Again, universals are created things in the Orthodox view. For example, St. Maximus says universals can perish. So universals are created noetic realities that exist in the conceptual realm. Angels are different from universals. For example, there's a universal angelic nature. So clearly angels are not the same thing as universals. So I think there's confusion here. I'm not trying to argue with you, but I think there's confusion here as to what universals are, what angels are, and the fact that God's being, God's omnipresence, those are divine energies, and those are uncreated. Universals and angels are two different types of created noetic things. Angels have personhood. Okay, Michael is a person. He's an angelic person with an angelic nature. So there's a distinction between nature and person in angels. Michael is not a universal. Tropes, $5. If orthodoxy is believed to be in orthodoxy, is heaven outside of time and space? It is, but it's also present in the liturgy. If so, how does the journey through the toll houses after death being compatible outside of it? Well, being outside of time and space doesn't mean that it's not also in time and space. It's both and. So don't think in these false either-or dialectics, right? I mean, the saints who are in heaven are outside of time and space, but they're also participating with us in the liturgy. That's the whole purpose of the already not yet. Heaven is brought to earth in the liturgy sphere. Are there 20 stages in a linear progression? Are the toll houses outside of space and time? Yeah, I think they are, right? So, I don't know that we know exactly how all that works, but you can't put it in this literal sort of like chronological, situation. Tropes, $2. What is the Orthodox stance on praying before eating? Yes, we should pray before we eat. Can it be done mentally if you're in public? Sure. Ken, $10. Jay, great stream. How does Christianity ameliorate the difference between creation and the extensive geological record on plate tectonics? I don't know enough about plate tectonics, so I don't know what you're referring to. Carbon dating is wrong, but it's also been right. Okay, well, so again, the dating is going to be on the basis of the presuppositions of the age of the decay. So nobody who does that typically assumes any early date, right? So in other words, it's baked into the testing itself, these gigantic aeons. Oh, well, we all know that this decay is at the rate of, whatever every million years, right? Well, nobody really knows that, but that's part of the theory. So again, I don't know what you're asking about the fossil record in terms of plate tectonics. I'm not a geologist. I don't know plate tectonics. Sorry. Frankie D, $5. I started laughing at the Barnes & Noble because I remember the Funko Pops rant. Well, you probably saw a bunch of stank-ass Funko Pops in the Barnes & Noble because that's all that's in there now. It's manga and Barnes & Noble. You are not exaggerating. It's not really a bookstore anymore. Yeah, I know. Exactly. There were tons of pagan and Wicca books, though. Yeah, so when you go in Barnes & Nobles now, it's like toys, trinkets, Harry Potter gear, manga, Funko Pops. I mean, it's all becoming Hell World. Jazz Gino, $10. What counts as the Word of God? Well, okay, first and foremost, the Word of God is not a book. It's not talking. It's a person. The Word of God is the Logos, the second person of the Godhead. The second person of the Godhead has a divine revelation, which is contained in Scripture and in tradition of the church, and also, in a generic sense, all of reality. The whole natural world is a theophanic manifestation of the Logos. So all of those things are Word of God in different ways and in different senses. I understand the Word of God originated orally. then scriptures are written. Orthodox say the traditions. Which one? The traditions in the Orthodox Church. So it's part of our heritage. In other words, when you go to the Orthodox Church and you see the liturgy, okay, the Bible didn't tell you how to worship. The apostles handed down an apostolic pattern of liturgical worship, which is confirmed and admitted by basically every church historian in history of liturgy, right? Admits that this is an apostolic tradition. So that's one example. Another example would be the tradition of the church, which determined the books that go in the Bible. So I can already tell your question is coming from a sola scriptura assumption here. And I'm just explaining to you two easy examples of tradition that are necessary for the church. One, the oral tradition relating to the liturgical worship, which the apostles handed down. And two, the oral tradition and traditions of the church, which determined the books that would go into the Bible, which the church decided centuries after the apostles. Sorry, I'm new here. How do we know the traditions and that are not the Word of God? Again, Word of God is not restricted to written texts. And so there's two types of Word of God. And when Paul was teaching, he says that his teaching was the Word of God. That he taught Timothy for 3 years in Ephesus, day and night. And he says, you hand on everything I taught you. Right? Not just the 2 letters that he wrote to Timothy, everything he taught, the whole body of doctrine. He tells Timothy to pass on that whole tradition to men after him that he lays hands on. That's apostolic succession. So all of those things. So you're kind of asking on Protestant presuppositions, where's the written list of all the oral traditions? Well, there's not, because some of those things went into and passed into the liturgy. Some of those things went into and passed into the apostolic succession, the lives of the saints, the daily readings, and some of those things went into how we determined what goes into the books of the Bible. So there's not going to be a Bible book that tells you all the traditions. Brock Baruch, elaboration, $1. I want to elaborate on the donation. For example, you go back far enough and you don't see reptiles in the fossil record. Well, that's just assuming that the dating is correct of how old the fossils are. So you're just reading into the geologic record the presuppositions of the strata and the dating. But that's the very thing that we don't know about. There's an increase in complexity over time. Yeah, assuming that your dating is correct. But that's the very thing that's in question. You're assuming that, well, it looks like it's taking zillions of years for these various strata to form. Well, maybe it didn't. I mean, go look at the Fly Geyser. We're told that these kinds of calcite structures are supposed to take millions of years, and yet the Fly Geyser formed over 40 or 50 years. How are there fossils that extend between various strata in the rocks that are supposed to be zillions of years apart? So there's plenty of counterexamples that people from your vantage point typically just ignore. And that's what I'm saying, that, well, I just don't buy the what was his name, Charles Lyell. I mean, Charles Lyell was the first one to propose what you're talking about, the different strata of the geologic record corresponding to these aeons of millions of years, and that's people don't even believe that anymore. People don't follow Lyell's approach anymore, and if I recall, that's been debunked, right? I mean, there's a whole chapter on this in Genesis, Creation, Early Man by Father Seraphim Rose. So, I mean, I'm just going to tell you the stuff that I've read from, ICR or whatever, Institute for Creation Research. So I'm not a scientist, I'm not a geologist, so it's not typically my approach. But I am a philosophical student, and so I can question your philosophic assumptions that go into the testing. And most of the time, the people who come to debate this stuff, they don't know anything. I'm not knocking you, but they don't typically know anything about philosophy, and so they don't even realize that they have all these philosophical assumptions baked into their testing methods, including of the geologic record, including of the carbon dating. And so when I start asking them the philosophical questions about, okay, really, so where in this did you observe, for example, a transmutation of species? Oh, well, we haven't observed that, but don't you see that if the flies in the jar, adapted to the jar, then clearly over zillions of years they would turn into another species? I mean, that's the stupid logic of this position. Which again, I mean, isn't it the case that the DNA within different species doesn't print code other than what's in that species? I'm using species in a loose sense here, right? Because, by the way, most of these people don't even think there is such a thing as species. They say it's just it's a created token term. There's not actually essences, which they're too stupid to understand that, philosophically speaking, to deny all essences means that their position is nonsense. But they don't even realize that's way too advanced for these people. Anyway,